Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I have a quick question for you. Are you team TV or team phone when watching these videos? Drop a comment with just one word TV or phone. And if you're enjoying these stories, your likes and comments really help support the channel and let me know you want more. So don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a spooky episode. Your engagement keeps the channel alive and helps bring you even more chilling tales. Now, let's see what the darkness has in store for us tonight. The night was still, with an oppressive silence hanging in the air. Amelia had fallen into a restless sleep, where dreams flickered like shadows, unclear but haunting. Pale moonlight streamed through the curtains, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. It felt like a scene ripped from one of those horror novels she'd often read before bed, though she tried to dismiss the eerie sensation. Suddenly, a voice shattered the tranquility of the night. "Amelia," the voice whispered. Soft, yet unmistakable, it sounded like it was coming from just beyond her bedroom door. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing as she sat up in bed, clutching her blanket tightly. The house was still, save for the soft creaking of the old wooden floors. But the voice that had sounded so real, like the disembodied voices she'd read about in short horror stories to read online, ones where ghostly presences linger just out of sight. "Amelia," the voice came again, this time more urgent and far too familiar. It was her voice distorted, but hers nonetheless. Fear coursed through her veins as she glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. The darkest hour. The hour when, in the scary stories to read in the dark she'd devoured, the veil between worlds was thinnest. She hesitated, remembering the unsettling tales she'd heard around the campfire during her youth's scary campfire stories that never quite left her mind. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling as it cut through the suffocating silence. No answer. Just the eerie stillness of the house, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Every sound, the ticking of the clock, the rustling of the wind outside, seemed amplified. Her instincts told her to stay in bed, but curiosity, the same kind that had always drawn her to good horror novels, compelled her to rise. Amelia's mind raced, flickering between the rational and the paranormal. She had long since outgrown her fear of the dark, but this felt different. This felt real. A part of her hoped it was just a trick of her mind, a lingering echo from the latest horror novels 2022 that had been keeping her up at night. As she approached the door, her feet brushed against the cold floor. The hallway beyond was swallowed in shadow, and the voice came again, softer this time. "Amelia, let me in." Her fingers hovered above the doorknob, her heart hammering in her chest. Was this some kind of joke? Had she been reading too many short, scary stories to read online? She wanted to believe it was all in her head, but the urgency in the voice made her hesitate. She twisted the knob and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, as if something was lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A chill ran down her spine. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, feeling the walls of the house close in on her. "Because I'm lonely," the voice replied, echoing from the darkness. The tone was almost pleading, pulling at her like the villain in the slasher novels she'd once been obsessed with, those killers who thrived in the dead of night, preying on those brave enough to face them. The voice beckoned again. "Amelia, open the door. Let me in." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body frozen in place. Fear and curiosity waged war within her. She could feel the pull, the magnetic draw of the voice. In her mind, she pictured what could be waiting beyond the threshold, a specter from one of the top horror novels, or perhaps something far more sinister, something even those terrifying, scary stories to tell had never quite prepared her for. But deep down, she knew this was no scary short story to read online. This was her life, and the choice she made tonight could change everything. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Whatever was out there, whatever waited for her, she had to face it. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door handle again, pulled it open, and stepped into the unknown. As Amelia faces her darkest fears, what would you do? Have you ever experienced a chilling moment like this? If you're enjoying these twists and turns, don't forget to hit that like button. Your thoughts on Amelia's choices. Share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear. And if you crave more of these scary stories to read in the dark, make sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales. You won't want to miss what happens next. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was a crisp autumn evening, and as the leaves crunched underfoot, Ben watched his reclusive neighbor, Mr. Gordon, slip out of his house yet again. Mr. Gordon had always been a mystery, keeping to himself, rarely speaking to anyone. His late-night walks had recently become more frequent, happening at the oddest hours, just after midnight or sometimes at dawn. Ben couldn't help but be curious. After all, he'd always been a fan of good horror novels and loved delving into scary stories to read in the dark. But now the mystery was real, right in front of him, in his own neighborhood. Initially, Ben dismissed his curiosity, convincing himself that everyone had their routines. However, as the weeks passed, the urgency in Mr. Gordon's movements during these midnight walks piqued his interest. One night, after reading one too many short scary stories to read online, Ben's curiosity finally got the better of him. He grabbed his jacket, slipped on his sneakers, and decided to follow Mr. Gordon. The crisp air bit at his skin as he kept his distance, hiding behind bushes and parked cars. Mr. Gordon, oblivious to being watched, walked with purpose. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, his head lowered as he made his way towards the woods that bordered their peaceful neighborhood. Ben hesitated for a moment at the edge of the tree line. The woods loomed dark and forbidding, like the setting of a scene from the top horror novels or one of those slasher novels he had read. He could almost imagine hearing the distant whisper of a voice saying, "Turn back," but he couldn't. Curiosity had its grip on him. He stepped into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet unnervingly loud in the stillness. He could see Mr. Gordon in the distance, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. The path twisted deeper into the forest, and Ben followed quietly, feeling a familiar, unnerving sensation crawling up his spine. It reminded him of those scary campfire stories he'd heard as a kid, the ones that left you looking over your shoulder long after the fire had died out. Mr. Gordon stopped at a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and boarded up. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet Mr. Gordon approached it with an unsettling sense of familiarity. Ben ducked behind a tree, watching as his neighbor hesitated at the door. For a long moment, Mr. Gordon simply stood there, as if weighing his options. Then, without looking back, he opened the door and disappeared inside. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't one of those short horror stories to read online. This was happening right now. What could Mr. Gordon possibly be doing in that cabin at this hour? The thrill of the unknown washed over Ben, mingling with a growing sense of dread. He knew he should turn back, but something inside him urged him forward. He crept closer, staying low, until he reached the side of the cabin. The door had been left slightly ajar, and through the crack, Ben could see faint light flickering inside. His breath caught in his throat as he caught sight of Mr. Gordon standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by strange objects. Old photographs lined the walls, faces twisted in anguish, their eyes wide with terror. Ben's stomach churned. He recognized some of the people in those photos. They were neighbors, all of whom had gone missing over the past few years. His hands trembled as he pulled back from the door. He had uncovered something far worse than he had ever imagined. Mr. Gordon wasn't just a strange man taking midnight walks. No, this was something far more sinister, like the twisted villains in horror novels 2022. Ben tried to back away quietly, but as he turned, his foot snapped a branch beneath him. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent night. He froze. Mr. Gordon's head snapped toward the door, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "Who's there?" Mr. Gordon's voice was low, menacing. Panic surged through Ben as he ducked behind the nearest tree, his heart pounding in his ears. He prayed Mr. Gordon hadn't seen him. The footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. Ben could barely breathe, each second stretching into eternity. Just as he was about to make a run for it, the door creaked open. Ben dared a glance around the tree and saw Mr. Gordon standing in the doorway, scanning the area. His breath was visible in the cold night air, and his eyes were sharp, like a predator searching for its prey. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Gordon turned back inside, muttering something to himself. The door creaked shut behind him. Ben didn't waste a second. He bolted through the woods, his feet barely touching the ground as branches whipped at his face and snagged his clothes. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his own house, slamming the door behind him. His mind raced with the horrific images from the cabin. He had never believed in monsters, but now he knew better. Sometimes they lived right next door. Dust motes danced in the dim light of the attic as Hannah sifted through old boxes, rediscovering the pieces of her family's history. It had been years since anyone had ventured up here, and each box seemed to hold a forgotten fragment of the past. She pushed aside old clothes, forgotten toys, and a few knickknacks, not expecting to find anything of significance. But then, tucked away at the bottom of one box, she found a faded envelope. Intrigued, she pulled it out and gently opened it. Inside was an old family photo, yellowed with age, the edges frayed. The image captured a sunny day, a family picnic in the park, with everyone gathered around a checkered blanket. Laughter seemed to echo from the photo, drawing Hannah in as she studied the familiar faces. Her grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, they were all there, youthful and full of life. But something was wrong. As she looked closer, her stomach churned. Every face in the photo was crossed out with thick black lines. Every face except for one. Her mother. The sight unsettled Hannah deeply. Why would someone do this? The scene reminded her of the haunting scenes she had read in short, scary stories to read online, where innocent objects became symbols of something much darker. She turned the photo over, but there was nothing written on the back, just the rough texture of aged paper. Questions swirled in her mind as she clutched the photo in her hand. What had happened to those people? Why was her mother's face the only one left untouched? Unable to shake the eerie feeling, Hannah descended the attic stairs, her heart pounding. She found her mother in the kitchen, carefully slicing into a freshly baked apple pie. The warm scent filled the air, but it did little to calm the chill creeping down Hannah's spine. "Mom," Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I show you something?" Her mother looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern when she saw Hannah's pale face. "Of course, sweetie. What is it?" Hannah laid the photo on the kitchen table, careful not to smudge the surface. Her mother's gaze fell upon the image, and Hannah watched as her expression changed first to confusion, then to something much darker. A shadow of sorrow crossed her face, and she sighed deeply. "Where did you find this?" her mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," Hannah replied, sitting across from her. "Mom, why are their faces crossed out?" A long silence stretched between them, the ticking of the kitchen clock growing louder with every second. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice heavy with regret. "It's a complicated story," she began, looking out the window as though the answers were hiding somewhere in the familiar view of their backyard, that day in the photo. It was one of the happiest days our family ever had. We were celebrating your uncle's return from the military. But shortly after that, everything changed. Hannah's heart sank. She had read about families hiding dark secrets in horror novels, but this was too real. A few months after that picture was taken, your uncle had a terrible car accident, her mother continued, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't survive. It shattered our family. People stopped coming around, distanced themselves. The grief was too much. Hannah's throat tightened. In the crossed-out faces, she asked quietly. Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. After the accident, it became too painful for some of the family to stay in touch. They drifted away, and one by one, they disappeared from our lives. I marked their faces as a way of coping, a way of remembering who was still part of our family and who was gone. Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes. It felt like the kind of loss she'd read about in good horror novels, where emotional scars ran deeper than any ghost or monster. I kept the photo all these years, her mother said, her voice trembling. It was the only thing I had left to remind me of what we lost. Hannah reached out, placing a comforting hand on her mother's. Mom, I wish I'd known sooner. We could have talked about it, together. Her mother smiled softly, though it was tinged with sorrow. I didn't want to burden you with it, but maybe it's time we start making new memories. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm golden glow across the room, Hannah realized that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still unwritten. Maybe they could reclaim some of what was lost and build new memories that honored the love that remained. Together, they tucked the photo away in a safe place, a symbol of the pain and the hope that lingered in their family's history. The early morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor as Mark unzipped his tent. The crisp air was invigorating, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. This was his first solo camping trip, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and immerse himself in nature's embrace. Mark had always been drawn to the wilderness, often reading good horror novels about campers who found themselves in terrifying situations. But this trip was supposed to be different, peaceful. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, Mark decided to explore the area. The woods felt alive with the symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves. He wandered deeper into the forest, marveling at how the light played through the trees. Each step felt like a release from the pressures of the city, a freedom that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hours into his hike, Mark found a small clearing with a pristine stream bubbling nearby. It was the perfect spot to rest, so he sat on a large rock, dipping his fingers into the cool water. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of nature wash over him. But then he heard something. A faint crackle, like a twig snapping. His eyes shot open as he instinctively scanned the surrounding trees. At first he saw nothing, just the woods, quiet and still. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darted between the trees. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was just a deer, or maybe a playful squirrel. After all, he had read plenty about the wildlife in the area, and it wasn't uncommon to encounter animals while hiking. But this felt different. The shadow was larger, more deliberate in its movement. It reminded him of the ominous figures described in scary stories to read in the dark, those unsettling presences that seemed to watch from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. He shrugged it off, attributing his unease to the isolation. Maybe he had been reading too many short horror stories to read online lately. The woods had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you were alone. After a while, Mark gathered his courage and decided to continue his exploration. He wandered deeper into the forest, fascinated by the intricate patterns of light and shadow. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and he knew he'd have to head back to his campsite soon. That's when he felt it again, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Mark turned abruptly, half expecting to find a curious animal watching him from a distance. But there was nothing, just trees. The feeling persisted, though the weight of being watched, a presence lurking just out of sight. It was unsettling, like something straight out of one of the scary campfire stories he'd grown up hearing. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to him. When he finally reached his campsite, he took a deep breath, relieved to be back in the familiar surroundings of his tent and fire pit. Mark set about gathering firewood, trying to focus on the task at hand. But every time he glanced over his shoulder, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The sun had set now, and the forest had transformed into a dark, whispering maze. He lit a small fire, the flickering flames casting warm light around him. The sound of crickets filled the night air, but it did little to soothe his nerves. He cooked a simple dinner, but his appetite had all but disappeared. As the night deepened, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down his spine. Mark told himself he was being foolish, just paranoid. He had spent too many nights reading slasher novels and top horror novels where campers never made it out of the woods. But still, he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. Deciding to turn in early, Mark sought refuge in his tent, zipping it up tight and hoping the thin nylon walls would provide some comfort. But sleep wouldn't come. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with images of the shadow he'd seen earlier. Was it really just his imagination? Just as he began to doze off, a loud crack echoed through the stillness. Mark jolted awake, adrenaline surging through him. The noise had come from just beyond the trees, near where his fire had burned down to embers. He lay still, listening. The night was eerily quiet now. The usual sounds of the forest had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence. Minutes felt like hours, and just as Mark was about to convince himself it was nothing, he heard it again, a soft whispering, too faint to make out, yet undeniably present. His breath quickened as the whispers grew closer, circling his campsite, lingering just outside the reach of the dying firelight. He could almost imagine the dark shapes from horror novels he had read, slipping silently through the trees. Unable to take it any longer, Mark unzipped his tent and peered into the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that danced among the trees. He scanned the area, his heart racing. Then he saw a figure, half hidden behind a tree. Mark's blood ran cold as he squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. Was it a trick of the light, or was someone or something watching him? "Hello," Mark called out, his voice shaky, betraying his fear. No response, just silence. Mark took a cautious step forward, the underbrush crunching beneath his feet. The figure shifted, and in that moment something primal took over. He turned and fled back into his tent, his mind a whirlwind of panic. He fumbled with the zipper, hands trembling as he sealed himself inside. He held his breath, straining to hear any sounds outside, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding like a drum. The whispers returned, closer now, circling his tent like a predator stalking its prey. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, wishing it all away. Just as he thought it might be over, there was a loud thud against the side of his tent, sending a shockwave of fear through him. The forest, which had once felt like a refuge, now loomed with dread. Mark lay there, wide awake, praying for dawn to break. But deep down, he knew that whatever had been watching him wasn't finished yet. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Grace sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and flipping through a stack of old photographs. Each image captured a memory, a moment in time that seemed so vivid, yet so distant. There were laughter, adventures, and secrets. Her friendship with Olivia had been one of the brightest threads woven into the fabric of her life. 3 years had passed since that tragic day when everything changed. Olivia had been full of life, a spark of joy wherever she went. But a sudden accident had stolen her away, leaving Grace with a void that she still struggled to fill. Since then, Grace had learned to navigate her grief, cherishing the memories while grappling with the silence Olivia left behind. As Grace sifted through the photos, she stumbled upon one of their last adventures together, a weekend camping trip in the woods. They had spent hours around the campfire, telling scary campfire stories and laughing until their sides hurt. Olivia's smile had been infectious, her spirit unbreakable. It was hard to believe that such joy could be eclipsed by loss. Suddenly, Grace's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tranquility of the moment. She glanced down, and her heart skipped a beat. The message on the screen was from Olivia's number. "I'm in trouble," the text read. Grace froze. Her mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, but none of them made sense. Olivia was gone. She had been gone for 3 years. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. But deep down, something stirred, a chill creeping up her spine, as if this was something out of one of those short horror stories to read online that always kept her awake at night. Pushing aside the disbelief, Grace typed back a response, her fingers trembling. "Olivia, is this really you?" She hesitated before hitting send. Was she losing her mind? But in her heart there was a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was some bizarre twist of fate. Seconds stretched into eternity, and each tick of the clock amplified her anxiety. Finally, her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to reality. "You need to help me. I don't have much time." Panic surged through Grace. How was this possible? How could Olivia be reaching out from beyond? The urgency in the message was unmistakable. It echoed through Grace's mind, bringing her back to the night of Olivia's accident, a night filled with unanswered questions and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She typed another message, her heart racing. "Where are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "The old cabin. The one we used to visit. Please hurry." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The old cabin. It was deep in the woods, the very place where they had shared some of their happiest moments. They hadn't been back since the accident. She had avoided it, unable to bear the memories. But now, the thought of Olivia possibly in danger pulled her from her seat. Grace grabbed her car keys and rushed out the door. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions as she drove. The familiar roads felt strange, each turn bringing back memories of laughter and carefree days. But now the weight of the past pressed heavily on her chest, mingling with the urgency of the present. When she finally arrived at the cabin, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The trees loomed large and dark, casting eerie shadows that flickered in her peripheral vision. The cabin, once a place of joy, now stood silent and unsettling. Its worn facade seemed to whisper secrets long forgotten, like the characters in the horror novels Grace had always loved reading. She stepped out of the car, the air thick with anticipation. Every scary story to tell she had ever heard replayed in her mind, warning her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not when Olivia needed her. Grace pushed open the creaky cabin door, her pulse quickening. Inside, everything was as they had left it, dusty, but familiar. The fireplace where they had roasted marshmallows still held the cold remnants of ash, a haunting reminder of happier times. Olivia, Grace called out, her voice trembling. Only silence answered her. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning every corner for any sign of her friend. In the back room, something caught her eye, a small object on the mantel. She approached it cautiously and realized it was Olivia's locket, the very one she had worn the night of the accident. Grace's hands shook as she picked it up, her heart pounding. Inside the locket was a picture of the two of them, smiling brightly against a backdrop of autumn leaves. But there was something else tucked inside a folded piece of paper. Grace's breath caught as she unfolded it, her mind racing with possibilities. The words scrawled across the paper sent a chill down her spine. Grace, not everything is as it seems. Trust your heart. She stood frozen, the world around her spinning. The messages. The locket. Olivia's voice in her mind, urging her to understand. Suddenly, everything clicked. The texts, the memories, the overwhelming feeling of connection. Olivia wasn't just sending a message from the beyond, she was reminding Grace of something deeper. Something that transcended time and space. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she whispered into the empty room, "Olivia, I wish I could have saved you." As the last words left her lips, a soft breeze swept through the cabin, carrying with it the warmth of remembrance. Grace felt a presence, an undeniable feeling that Olivia was there with her, guiding her through the darkness. Clutching the locket tightly, Grace made a promise. She would carry Olivia's spirit with her, honoring her memory with every step she took. She wasn't alone. She never had been. After moving into her new apartment, Emma felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The one-bedroom unit was cozy, located in an older building with creaky floors and charmingly mismatched fixtures. The first few days passed quickly as she unpacked boxes and settled in. It felt like a fresh start, and Emma was ready for it. But soon, unsettling things began to happen. It started with a simple note. One morning, Emma found a piece of paper folded neatly on her kitchen counter. It was an odd discovery, as she didn't recall leaving any notes around. Curiosity piqued, she unfolded the paper to find the handwriting neat and precise, almost too perfect. "Don't forget to water the plants," it read. Emma didn't own any plants. She chuckled, assuming it was a mistake, perhaps left by the previous tenant. But as the days passed, more notes appeared, and each one was more unsettling than the last. Emma felt like she had stepped into one of those short, scary stories to read online, the kind that started innocently enough before things spiraled out of control. One morning, she found another note taped to her bathroom mirror. "The hot water runs out faster than you think," it said. Emma paused, thinking back to her shower the previous day. The water had gone cold sooner than usual, but she brushed it off as a minor inconvenience. Now it felt more like a warning. It was becoming clear that the notes were not random, they were personal. Someone had been watching her. The realization sent a chill down her spine, reminding her of the unsettling suspense she often read in horror novels. Trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, Emma convinced herself it was all a coincidence. But the more she tried to ignore the notes, the more persistent they became. Another appeared on her bedside table. "Don't leave the window open tonight." It was a warm evening, and she had indeed left her window open, something she rarely did. That's when she knew this was no coincidence. Someone or something was watching her. It felt like one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the protagonist slowly realizes they're being hunted, their every move monitored by a faceless figure. Emma couldn't ignore it any longer. She began to monitor her own surroundings, leaving her apartment and lingering in the hallway, pretending to check her phone while glancing at her neighbors' doors. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She kept her doors locked, her curtains drawn, trying to fortify her space against the unknown. Then, another note appeared, more chilling than the rest. She found it lying on her coffee table after returning from a grocery run. "Enjoy your tea, but be careful with the sugar." Emma froze. She had just made a cup of tea, but she hadn't added sugar. The implication of the note hit her like a wave of ice. Someone was not only watching her, but they knew the details of her daily routine. This wasn't just a scary short story to read online, this was her life. Frustrated and terrified, Emma decided to confront her tormentor. She wrote a note of her own, slipped it under her front door, and waited. It was a simple message, written in trembling handwriting. "Stop. I know you're watching me." For days, there were no new notes. The silence was almost suffocating, but Emma allowed herself to relax, believing the strange ordeal was over. Maybe whoever had been watching her had decided to move on. But then, just as she was starting to feel safe again, another note appeared. This one was different, tucked inside the pages of a book she had been reading, a good horror novel she had picked up recently to distract herself. "You should know I have your back," the note read. Emma's heart raced. This wasn't a prank. It felt like a game she didn't want to play, a cruel twist straight out of the slasher novels she'd seen in movies, where the protagonist realizes they are never alone, even in their most private moments. The walls of her apartment began to feel like a prison, the shadows lengthening with each passing day. Desperation crept in, mixing with her growing paranoia. She installed a small security camera at her front door, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was tormenting her. She spent hours reviewing the footage, looking for any sign of movement, but nothing seemed out of place. The hallway was always empty, the door remained closed, but the notes continued. One night, Emma found a note on her pillow, sending a jolt of fear through her. "I'm closer than you think." That night, she lay wide awake, every sound amplified in the silence. She could barely close her eyes, terrified of what might happen next. The familiar details of her apartment, the comforting glow of the streetlights outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator now felt sinister, as if they were hiding something she couldn't see. In a last-ditch effort, Emma decided to seek help. She uploaded the security footage and her story to an online community, hoping for advice. The responses flooded in, a mix of sympathy, disbelief, and suggestions. Some people told her to confront her neighbors. Others advised her to call the police. But no one had concrete answers. That evening, another note appeared. This time it was different, tucked into a place she would never have expected, inside her shoe, right where she'd have to find it before leaving the apartment. "I'll see you soon." Emma's blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they were bolder now, unafraid to cross boundaries. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she did, this game of cat and mouse was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty street as Lauren leaned against the cool brick wall of her favorite cafe. The familiar scent of coffee and baked goods filled the air, but today her stomach was heavy with something else, in uneasy anticipation. Her brother Jason had just left to run a quick errand. She watched as he turned the corner, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Lauren could remember the exact moment it happened. A sudden shout echoed through the street, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps. She pushed off the wall, her heart racing. A figure darted past her, tall and wiry, clutching Jason's backpack. Panic surged through her as she realized that the bag held more than just his laptop. In school books, it contained precious keepsakes, irreplaceable items that Jason always carried with him. Before Lauren could react, Jason was already in hot pursuit, shouting after the thief. The man glanced back, his face set in a wild expression, determination flashing in his eyes. Jason's long strides quickly closed the gap between them, but the thief had a head start. Lauren stood frozen, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Should she run after them? Should she stay behind and call for help? The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as she watched them disappear around the corner. She took a deep breath and pushed through the cafe door, trying to steady herself. The world around her felt suddenly too quiet, too still. They reminded her of the tense moments in the top horror novels she had read, the calm before everything went terribly wrong. The street was bustling with people, but time seemed to slow down as Lauren scanned the area, desperately searching for any sign of Jason or the thief. Her thoughts raced as she considered what might happen if Jason caught up to the man. What if the thief was armed? What if Jason got hurt? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where everything spirals out of control before you even know what's happening. With her heart pounding, Lauren hurried down the sidewalk, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. She rounded the corner, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, but the street was empty. The city, once alive with energy, now felt eerie and desolate. "Jason," she shouted, her voice bouncing off the nearby buildings. Silence answered her. A growing sense of dread pooled in her stomach as she retraced their possible route. Each corner she turned held the promise of finding them, but time and again, she was met with nothing but empty streets. It felt like she was living in a horror novel, the kind where the protagonist is forced to navigate a labyrinth of suspense and fear, all the while knowing that something is terribly wrong. Lauren's phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. She fumbled to answer it, hoping it was Jason. But it wasn't. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen, the words sending a chill down her spine. "I have your brother. If you want him back, meet me at the old warehouse by the docks." For a moment, everything around Lauren seemed to blur. Her mind raced, her hands trembling as she read the message again. Could this be real? It felt like she had stepped into the plot of one of those slasher novels she loved, where the protagonist has to make life or death decisions in the face of unimaginable danger. Her instincts screamed at her to call the police, to stay put and let the authorities handle it. But another part of her, the part that couldn't bear the thought of Jason in danger, urged her to act. She couldn't just sit by and wait. With her heart pounding in her chest, Lauren made her decision. She grabbed her jacket and keys, ready to face whatever awaited her at the docks. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting an ominous orange glow over the city. It felt like the setting of a scary campfire story, the kind where the tension builds until the air is so thick with fear that you can barely breathe. The drive to the docks was a blur. Every turn felt like it was leading her further away from safety, deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The world outside the car window seemed foreign, twisted by her anxiety. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, each thud reminding her that time was running out. When she finally arrived at the old warehouse, the area was eerily quiet. The building loomed ahead of her, its faded exterior draped in shadows. Lauren swallowed hard and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with dread, and every part of her screamed to turn back. But she couldn't. She made her way to the entrance, her hands trembling as she pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the setting sun through the broken windows. It felt like the climax of one of those scary stories to read in the dark, the kind where you know the worst is just around the corner. "Jason," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. No response, just silence. Her phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen illuminating the darkness. Another message from the same unknown number: "Come inside. You're almost there." Lauren's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, stepping further into the warehouse. Her footsteps echoed, each step amplifying the tension that hung in the air. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound magnified by the silence. It reminded her of the short horror stories to read online that always seemed to get under her skin, making her question every little thing around her. Suddenly, she heard a soft noise. It was faint, but unmistakable, Jason's voice. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, pushing past old crates and abandoned equipment until she reached the back of the warehouse. There, in the dim light, she saw Jason tied to a chair, his eyes wide with fear. "Lauren," he called out, struggling against his bonds. She rushed to him, her hands working quickly to untie the ropes. But just as she loosened the last knot, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." Lauren spun around, her heart pounding as a figure stepped out of the darkness. If this story left you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if you were in Lauren's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. And if you enjoy scary stories to tell like this, make sure to subscribe for more heart-pounding tales. You won't want to miss what happens next. In the heart of the city, a sprawling park offered a quiet escape from the urban rush. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Mia decided to take a leisurely stroll, her feet crunching through the golden leaves that covered the ground. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the endless tasks that awaited her: work deadlines, social obligations, and the constant buzz of life. But here, in the serenity of the park, everything seemed to fade away. As she walked along the path, admiring the trees illuminated by the soft sunlight, she noticed a figure in the distance. At first, the person blended into the background, just another face in the crowd. But as Mia looped around a bend, she caught another glimpse, and her heart skipped a beat. The woman in the distance looked eerily familiar. Long dark hair fell over her shoulders, her features sharp as though chiseled from stone. What unsettled Mia was that the woman wasn't just anyone, she looked exactly like her. It felt like something out of one of those horror novels Mia often lost herself in, where the main character is haunted by a strange doppelganger. Mia shook her head, brushing it off as a trick of the light. But as she continued her walk, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It reminded her of the unsettling tension she felt when reading scary short stories to read online, where the protagonist slowly realizes that something or someone is following them. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw the woman again, closer this time. Their eyes locked for a brief moment. Mia's heart raced as she picked up her pace. Was this woman following her? Was it just her imagination? She tried to tell herself that this was a public park, filled with people, and it was nothing to worry about. But as she quickened her pace, so did the woman. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She had read plenty of scary stories to tell around a campfire growing up, and one thing she had learned was to trust her instincts. Something about this situation felt wrong. Every fiber of her being urged her to leave the park, but the rational side of her argued against it. Maybe it was just coincidence, she thought. Maybe this woman wasn't following her at all. Despite her attempts to rationalize it, the tension gnawed at her, just like the fear she'd felt while reading top horror novels. She walked faster, her eyes darting around, searching for an exit. The laughter of children and the distant hum of city life faded into the background as Mia's focus narrowed on the woman. The stranger matched her every movement, her long strides mirroring Mia's. Panic surged through Mia as she turned a corner, finding herself alone on a secluded path. Her heart pounded in her chest as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sense of foreboding. It was like she had stepped into one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the setting seems peaceful until everything goes wrong. Mia spun around, prepared to confront the woman, but when she turned, the woman was gone. The path behind her was empty, silent, as though the stranger had never been there at all. Mia stood frozen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Had she imagined it? She took a few hesitant steps forward, glancing around, her nerves still on edge. That's when she heard a soft rustling behind her. Mia whipped around, her eyes wide, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Her pulse quickened as the shadows seemed to lengthen around her, the once peaceful park now feeling like the setting of a slasher novel. And then she saw her. The woman was standing just a few feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, Her eyes locked onto Mia's with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Mia took a step back, her mind racing. This felt too real to be her imagination, but it also felt impossible. Who was this woman, and why did she look exactly like her? Summoning her courage, Mia called out, her voice shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, watching, her eyes boring into Mia's. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice soft and hauntingly familiar. "I am you." Mia's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman took a step forward, her figure eerily graceful, like she was gliding through the air. "I am everything you fear, everything you run from." Mia's breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. It felt like she had stepped into the pages of one of those horror novels 2022 that kept her up at night, where the protagonist's darkest fears manifest before their eyes. The woman's gaze softened as she moved closer. "You can't run from yourself, Mia." Mia stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? She had read good horror novels before, but nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her to face herself, literally. "I don't know what you are," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "But you're not me." The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I am the part of you that you refuse to see. The part you've buried deep down, hoping it would disappear. But I'm still here, and I always will be." Mia's back hit the trunk of a tree, her escape route blocked. The woman stood before her, her presence overwhelming, like a mirror reflecting Mia's deepest insecurities. "You need to accept me," the woman said, her voice soft yet firm. "Only then can you be free." Mia felt tears prick at her eyes. The weight of the woman's words crushed her, forcing her to confront everything she had been avoiding. But as she stood there, face to face with her own fears, something shifted inside her. She realized that maybe, just maybe, this woman wasn't her enemy. Maybe she was her strength. Mia took a deep breath, her heart steadying. "What do I have to do?" The woman's smile softened. "You already know the answer." And just like that, the woman began to fade, her figure dissolving into the golden light of the park. Mia stood there, breathless, as the tension lifted, leaving her with a strange sense of peace. As the last rays of sunlight streamed through the trees, Mia understood. She wasn't running anymore. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like this video. Have you ever confronted your deepest fears? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoy eerie tales like this, make sure to subscribe for more scary stories to read in the dark. There's plenty more to come. The soft hum of rain against the windows filled the room as Sophia curled up on her couch with a steaming cup of tea. It was her favorite time of year, cool autumn nights, perfect for losing herself in the pages of her favorite horror novels. The latest one she'd picked up, a bestseller among horror novels 2022, was gripping, filled with eerie tales of haunted houses and restless spirits. Tonight, though, something felt off. The house was too quiet. Sophia pushed the unsettling feeling aside and continued reading. Outside, the rain grew heavier, each drop drumming harder against the glass. Just as she was getting to a particularly tense chapter, her phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table, startling her. The screen lit up with an unknown number. She hesitated, staring at the phone. Who could be calling her so late? Normally, Sophia would ignore unknown numbers, but something compelled her to answer this time. Maybe it was curiosity, the same curiosity that always led her to scary stories to read in the dark stories that made her question the safety of her own surroundings. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello. For a moment, all she heard was static, a crackling that sent a chill down her spine. She was about to hang up when a voice, barely audible, broke through the noise. Sophia. Help me. Her heart stopped. She gripped the phone tighter. Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling. The static intensified, and then, just as quickly, it cut off. The line went dead. Sophia stared at the phone in disbelief, her mind racing. The voice had been so familiar. It sounded like her old college roommate, Sarah, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She put the phone down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that settled over her. It was probably just a prank, or maybe she was imagining things. After all, she'd spent hours reading scary short stories to read online, the kind that made her jump at every sound. But deep down, Sophia couldn't let it go. There was something about that voice, it wasn't just a coincidence. She decided to text Sarah just to check in. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen as she typed a casual message. Hey Sarah, it's been a while. Are you okay? The minutes ticked by with no response. Sophia set her phone down, trying to focus on her book again, but the words blurred together as her mind kept returning to the call. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, the house now filled with an uncomfortable stillness. Then her phone buzzed again. She snatched it up quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Sarah's name on the screen. A single message appeared. I need you. Sophia's pulse quickened. She typed a response, her hands shaking. Sarah, where are you? What's going on? The reply came almost instantly. The cabin. Please hurry. Sophia's heart dropped. The cabin. They hadn't been there in years. It was an old place deep in the woods where they used to escape during college breaks, sharing laughter and scary campfire stories late into the night. But those memories had long since faded, overshadowed by the tragic accident that happened during their last trip. After that night, none of them had ever gone back. Panic rose in Sophia's chest. She couldn't shake the sense of dread settling over her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and jacket, bolting out the door. The drive to the cabin was long and treacherous, with the winding road slick from the rain. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the trees towering like silent sentinels as she sped through the forest. The road felt endless, her headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. As she drove, memories of that last trip surfaced. Sarah, always the life of the party, laughing and telling everyone to lighten up as they huddled around the campfire. That was the night they told the scariest of all scary stories to tell about a girl who disappeared in the woods and was never seen again. None of them had known then that their own night would end in tragedy. When Sophia finally arrived at the cabin, it looked exactly as she remembered, worn, weathered, and abandoned. The air was thick with tension, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows over the clearing. She parked and stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cool night air. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. Sophia hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not when Sarah had reached out to her. She couldn't leave her friend alone. With a deep breath, Sophia approached the cabin, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. She pushed open the door, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. Inside, the cabin was cold, empty. Dust covered every surface, and the faint smell of damp wood lingered in the air. There was no sign of Sarah. As Sarah Sophia called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The only sound was the soft dripping of water from a leak in the roof. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she ventured deeper into the cabin, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. She reached the main room and froze. There, in the middle of the floor, was a single object, Sarah's old backpack. the same one she had brought on their last trip all those years ago. Sophia's hands trembled as she knelt down, unzipping it. Inside was a faded photograph of the two of them, taken on the day of their arrival at the cabin. They were smiling, carefree, unaware of the darkness that was about to unfold. Sophia's phone buzzed again in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. Another message from Sarah. Turn around. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned, her eyes scanning the empty room. But there was no one there. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, a biting chill filling the air. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cabin into darkness. Sophia's phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with one final message. I'm not alone. Sophia's scream echoed through the empty cabin as she backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out. She turned and ran, bursting through the front door and into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands fumbling with the keys as she sped away from the cabin, the forest closing in around her. Whatever was waiting for her in that cabin, she wasn't ready to face it. It was late in the evening when Lucas finally sat down in his living room, feeling the exhaustion of the day wash over him. The old farmhouse, passed down through generations, creaked with age as the wind howled outside. The isolated location had always provided peace and quiet, but tonight something felt different, something unsettling lingered in the air. Lucas had always loved good horror novels, especially the ones that made you question what was real and what was imagined. Tonight, though, the unease in the pit of his stomach wasn't fictional. The wind outside rattled the windows, but the farmhouse held steady as Lucas settled in for the night. His favorite chair creaked under his weight, and he began flipping through channels, trying to find something to distract himself. As he mindlessly scrolled through the TV, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from an unknown number appeared. How's the farmhouse? I'm coming over soon. Lucas furrowed his brow. It was a strange message, and he didn't recognize the number. He had no plans to meet anyone tonight. The message felt like something out of a scary short story to read online, the kind where a seemingly innocent text leads to something far more sinister. He shrugged it off, thinking it must have been sent by mistake. Maybe someone was texting the wrong person. But as the night grew later and the house seemed to settle into a deeper silence, the unease returned. The wind outside had died down, but the stillness that replaced it felt heavier. Half an hour later, his phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. I'm closer now. Lucas sat up straight, his heart pounding. His first instinct was to call the number back, but something told him that wouldn't be a good idea. His pulse quickened as the house seemed to grow colder. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The old farmhouse had been his sanctuary for years, a place of comfort. But now it felt like the walls were closing in, like something unseen was watching him. His phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't want to read the message. But he couldn't help himself. His hand shook slightly as he picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. I'm at the door. Lucas shot to his feet, adrenaline surging through him. His eyes darted toward the front door, which stood at the far end of the living room. Everything in him screamed not to check. It was like the beginning of one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the protagonist always made the wrong choice, opening the door to their worst fears. He approached the door cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air in the room had thickened. He reached the door and peered through the peephole, holding his breath. Nothing. The front porch was empty. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves as a breeze picked up again. Lucas let out a breath, relieved but still on edge. He double-checked the lock and turned to head back to the couch. Then, the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the room, sending a chill down Lucas's spine. His mind raced. He had just checked the porch, there had been no one there. The knock sounded again, louder this time. It felt like the climax of one of those slasher novels he had read, where the danger was always closer than you thought. "Who's there?" Lucas called out, his voice steadier than he felt. No answer, just silence. He wasn't going to open the door, not without knowing who or what was on the other side. His phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but he forced himself to check the message. Open the door. His hands trembled as he stood frozen in place. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in the quiet room. It was the kind of dread you read about in top horror novels, the slow realization that something evil was near. Lucas had never believed in the supernatural, but tonight it felt like the farmhouse was haunted by something far worse than a ghost. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. Lucas spun around, his eyes wide with fear. The living room was empty, but he could feel that sensation of being watched. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the air seemed to grow colder. The shadows in the room stretched longer, darker, as if something was lurking just beyond his vision. His phone buzzed again. "I'm inside." Panic surged through Lucas. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had locked all the doors, secured every window. But somehow, whoever was texting him was already inside the house. It was like one of those scary campfire stories where the monster is already in the room before you even know it. He backed up against the wall, his hand fumbling to find something, anything to defend himself. But the house remained silent still. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the faint buzzing of his phone as another message came through. "Look behind you." Lucas froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He didn't want to turn around, but the pull was too strong. Slowly he turned his head, expecting to see someone standing behind him. But the room was empty. The cold air wrapped around him, suffocating, as his eyes darted around the room. He couldn't see anyone, but he could feel the presence, something watching him, something waiting. His phone buzzed once more. "I'm closer than you think." Lucas's vision blurred as fear overwhelmed him. He couldn't stay in the house. Not with this unseen guest, this thing that seemed to know his every move. He grabbed his keys and ran for the door, not daring to look back. The phone buzzed again, but he ignored it as he jumped into his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled to start the engine. As he sped down the dark country road, leaving the farmhouse behind, his phone buzzed one final time. "I'll see you soon." Tara sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes of old photographs, each one like a window into a different time. Her family had lived in this house for decades, and every so often she enjoyed digging through these memories, trying to piece together their long, rich history. That evening, she was searching for a specific photo, one of her grandmother standing in front of the old family farmhouse. But what she found was something else entirely. It was an image she had never seen before, faded and yellowed with age. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of an old barn, smiling brightly for the camera. But there was something off. The more Tara stared at it, the more a feeling of unease settled over her. There, standing just behind the group, was a figure faint, almost like a shadow. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer she looked, the clearer it became. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face partially obscured, stood at the edge of the frame. Her eyes, though barely visible, seemed to stare directly at Tara. It reminded her of those scary short stories to read online, where something unsettling always lurked in the background, just waiting to be noticed. Tara's heart skipped a beat. She had gone through these boxes countless times, but she had never seen this photo before, and she certainly didn't remember anyone mentioning a mysterious figure in the family albums. She flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue, but the back was blank. No date, no names, just a faint smudge of ink. The farmhouse in the picture was her grandparents' old place, the one she had visited as a child. It had long since been abandoned, left to decay in the woods after her grandparents passed. Tara hadn't been back in years, not since her parents sold the property. But now, staring at the photo, a chill ran down her spine. Who was that woman? She quickly packed up the boxes, her hands trembling slightly. But the image stayed with her, the mysterious figure burned into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen the woman before, not just in the photograph, but somewhere else. Maybe in the stories her grandmother used to tell her as a child, tales that seemed harmless at the time, but now took on a darker tone. Later that night, after trying to distract herself with a movie, Tara found herself still thinking about the photo. It was like she had stepped into one of the scary stories to tell she had heard growing up, the kind where a single, strange discovery sets off a chain of terrifying events. Unable to resist, she grabbed her laptop and began searching for any information about the old farmhouse, hoping to find some history about the land or the people who lived there before her family. What she found was more unsettling than she had expected. The farmhouse had been built in the late 1800s, and the land had changed hands several times before her grandparents bought it. According to local folklore, the area was rumored to be haunted. Tara's heart pounded as she read accounts of strange sightings, ghostly figures seen near the barn, disembodied voices heard in the woods. One name kept coming up: Lily Carpenter. Lily had lived in the farmhouse long before Tara's family had owned it. She was a widow, known for her reclusive nature. Some said she practiced strange rituals in the woods. Others claimed she never left the house after her husband's sudden death. But what sent a shiver down Tara's spine was the story of Lily's disappearance. One day she had simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers of ghostly sightings around the property. Tara's mind raced. The figure in the photo, could it be Lily? Was this one of those good horror novels she loved reading, where the past never truly stayed buried? She had to know more. Without giving herself time to second-guess the decision, Tara grabbed her keys and headed out to the farmhouse. It was only an hour's drive away, but it felt like she was traveling to another world once steeped in mystery and fear. As she drove down the winding roads, the sky grew darker, the trees casting long shadows across the narrow path. The house came into view, its roof sagging, windows boarded up, and the barn just visible in the distance. The air was heavy with the weight of forgotten memories, and the silence was deafening. It was like stepping into one of those horror novels where the protagonist returns to the place that holds the answers to their darkest fears. Tara parked the car and hesitated, staring at the house. Every instinct told her to leave, to turn back and forget about the photo. But she couldn't. Not now. She approached the front door, which creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The inside of the house was cold, the musty smell of decay filling the air. Her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as she made her way to the back, where the barn stood just beyond the overgrown fields. As she stepped outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass. Tara's heart raced as she approached the barn, the same one from the photograph. She could almost feel the eyes of the woman in the picture watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. The barn door groaned as she pulled it open, the dark interior swallowing her whole. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust and shadows. The inside of the barn was empty, save for a few old tools and broken furniture. But something in the far corner caught her eye: an old mirror, its glass cloudy with age. She stepped closer, her reflection distorted in the cracked surface. And then she saw her, the woman from the photograph. She stood behind Tara, her figure faint but unmistakable, her eyes locked onto Tara's through the reflection. Tara's breath hitched in her throat as she spun around, but the barn was empty. Her heart pounded in her ears as she turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden sound making her jump. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she read the message. "Do you see me now?" Tara's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as her mind tried to make sense of what she had just seen. The photo, the figure in the mirror, was it real? Was Lily Carpenter still haunting the land, waiting for someone to notice her? The air grew colder, and Tara knew she couldn't stay any longer. She bolted out of the barn, the wind whipping through the trees as she ran back to her car. As she drove away, the farmhouse disappeared into the distance, but the image of the woman stayed with her, burned into her mind. And as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she swore she saw her again, standing at the edge of the road, watching. Late one night, Ethan sat at his desk, tapping away at his laptop in his dimly lit apartment. His office was his sanctuary, a small room cluttered with books, scattered notes, and the glowing hum of his computer screen. It was the perfect space to work on his passion project, a new novel, one inspired by the good horror novels he'd read over the years. But tonight, the creative process was slow, his thoughts wandering as the clock ticked past midnight. The apartment was unusually quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet. Ethan had lived there for a few months now, and though he enjoyed the peace and quiet, something about the building always made him uneasy. The other tenants rarely spoke, the hallways were dim, and sometimes late at night he'd hear faint footsteps from the floor above. But there wasn't supposed to be anyone living up there. The landlord had told him the unit was vacant. Still, Ethan tried to brush off the eerie feelings, as his imagination running wild after all. He'd been spending hours diving into short horror stories to read online and scary stories to tell, so it was no wonder his mind was playing tricks on him. But as the night stretched on, that nagging sense of unease refused to leave. Around 2 a.m., just as Ethan was about to call it a night, something strange happened. The lights in his apartment flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Ethan groaned, annoyed. The power had been unstable in the building before, but this outage felt different, more sudden, like the lights had been intentionally snuffed out. He fumbled around in the dark, reaching for his phone. The screen illuminated his face as he pulled up his flashlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He got up and headed toward the hallway to check the fuse box, hoping it was just a minor issue. But as he stepped into the hallway, a chill ran down his spine. The hallway was completely dark, not a single light shining from the other apartments. And yet, it didn't feel empty. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he made his way toward the electrical panel, his pulse quickening with every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was the same sensation he'd read about in horror novels, the creeping dread, the sudden awareness that someone or something was watching. He reached the fuse box and opened it, squinting in the dim light from his phone. To his confusion, none of the breakers were tripped. The power should have been on. He flipped a few switches back and forth, but nothing happened. His apartment, and the entire floor, remained shrouded in darkness. As he turned to head back to his room, Ethan's phone buzzed in his hand. He paused, glancing down at the screen. A text message appeared from an unknown number. "Stay out of the dark." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, his mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was it a joke? He glanced around, half expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the dark, empty corridor. No answer. Just silence. He took a deep breath and tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone in the building was messing with him. But as he made his way back to his apartment, his phone buzzed again. "I see you." Ethan's blood ran cold. He whipped around, shining the light from his phone down the hallway. There was no one there, just the long stretch of darkness. His heart raced as he backed into his apartment, locking the door behind him. He had never believed in the supernatural, but tonight, it felt like something from one of those scary stories to read in the dark was unfolding in real life. His phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light in the dark room. "Don't turn off the light." Ethan's hands shook as he held his phone, glancing around the room. But there was no light, just the faint glow of his phone screen. He tried to shake off the fear gripping him, but the messages felt too real, too personal. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise behind him, a soft creak, like the sound of someone shifting their weight. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as he slowly turned around, his phone held out in front of him like a shield. The light from the screen flickered across the room, illuminating the shadows as they seemed to stretch toward him. There, in the corner of the room, something moved. His pulse raced as he pointed the light directly at the corner. For a moment, he saw nothing. But then, just as he was about to relax, a figure stepped forward, tall, dark, and faceless, like a shadow come to life. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. He bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as his hands shook. His phone buzzed one more time, the message burning into his mind. It's too late. The room grew colder, and Ethan could feel the figure's presence looming behind him. He forced the door open and ran into the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty building. His heart pounded as he made his way down the stairs, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the entire building was alive, feeding off his fear. As he burst through the front door of the apartment complex and into the cool night air, he didn't stop running until he reached the street. Panting, he glanced back at the building, half expecting to see the figure standing in one of the windows, watching him leave. But the windows were dark, and the building was silent. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before looking at the screen. A single message from the same unknown number appeared. "See you soon." The late evening sun cast a reddish hue over the highway as Julia drove home from her weekend getaway. The roads were mostly empty, with only a few cars speeding by in the opposite direction. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her thoughts wandering between the peaceful days she had spent in the countryside and the good horror novels she had devoured during her stay. The thought of curling up with another scary short story to read online when she got home made the long drive ahead feel a little less tedious. As the sky darkened and the stars began to peek through, Julia noticed something strange. In her rear-view mirror, the outline of a car appeared, its headlights off, but still close enough for her to see the silhouette. She frowned, adjusting the mirror to get a better look, but the vehicle was just a shadow in the distance. It wasn't uncommon for drivers to forget their headlights, but something about this car unsettled her. She sped up, hoping to put some distance between them, but the car stayed with her, keeping its distance but never falling too far behind. The situation reminded her of the scary stories to read in the dark that always left her wondering what might be lurking just out of sight. The road stretched endlessly before her, winding through the forest with no signs of civilization for miles. Julia tried to focus on the road, telling herself it was nothing, just another driver heading home. But the eerie feeling in her stomach wouldn't leave. Another glance in the rearview mirror made her heart skip a beat. The car was closer now. Still no headlights. Just the dark silhouette, trailing her, almost like a predator stalking its prey. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The darkness around her seemed to close in, and the familiar comfort of driving alone was replaced with a creeping sense of dread. Trying to shake off the feeling, Julia turned on the radio, hoping to distract herself with some music. But no matter what station she tuned into, all she could hear was static. The sound crackled through the speakers, adding to her growing sense of unease. It felt like the beginning of one of those slasher novels where the tension builds and builds and builds until it's too late. The car behind her suddenly accelerated, getting even closer. Panic surged through Julia as she pressed harder on the gas, her heart pounding in her chest. Why wasn't the driver passing her? Why had they been following her for so long? Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling her. She glanced down quickly, noticing a message from an unknown number. With trembling hands, she unlocked her phone and read the text. "Why are you speeding?" Julia's blood ran cold. She looked back at the road, her pulse racing. How could anyone know she was speeding? She checked the rearview mirror again. The car was still there, looming behind her like a shadow. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was the driver watching her? Had they somehow hacked into her phone? Or was this something far more sinister? The road ahead was still empty, stretching out into the dark forest. Julia pressed her foot down harder on the accelerator, desperate to put some distance between herself and the car. But no matter how fast she went, the car followed, matching her speed perfectly. The headlights remained off, the silhouette a constant presence in her rearview mirror. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. You can't outrun me. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as fear gripped her. This wasn't a prank. This was real. She was being followed. The road curved sharply ahead, and as she swerved around the bend, she made a decision. There was a rest stop a few miles up the road. She would pull over there, get out, and call for help. There had to be other drivers there. Someone would help her. She sped around the curve, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The rest stop came into view, a dimly lit parking lot with a few cars scattered around. Relief washed over her as she pulled in, her tires screeching slightly as she parked under a flickering streetlight. For a moment, she sat there, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white with fear. The car behind her slowed down but didn't stop. It passed by the rest stop, its dark silhouette fading into the night. Julia let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with adrenaline. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe it was just a coincidence. She grabbed her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, to talk about what had just happened. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. Nice try. Julia froze. Her heart raced as she looked around the parking lot. There were a few cars parked here, but none seemed out of place. She scanned the area, her pulse quickening. No one seemed to be watching her. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. Check your back seat. Julia's blood turned to ice. Her hand hovered over the lock button, and she glanced at the rearview mirror. The back seat looked empty, but the darkness made it impossible to be sure. Her hands trembled as she turned around slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The back seat was empty, but the door was unlocked. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. Had someone been in the car with her the entire time? Was she alone now, or was this just part of the game? Julia's mind raced as she locked all the doors, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had to get out of here. She started the engine and peeled out of the rest stop, her heart pounding. As she sped down the highway, her phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it. She couldn't. All she could think about was getting home, getting away from whatever was following her. The highway seemed endless, the trees blurring past as her car roared down the road. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still with her, that the stranger wasn't done yet. Her phone buzzed one final time, and despite every instinct telling her not to, she glanced at the screen. I'll see you soon. Julia's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the darkness stretched out before her. She didn't know how, but she knew the stranger was right. On a crisp autumn evening, Ava stood in her bathroom, brushing her teeth in front of the mirror. The routine was comforting, a moment of normalcy at the end of a long day. She stared at her reflection, noting the fatigue in her eyes and the faint circles beneath them. She had been staying up late, binge reading good horror novels and scary short stories to read online, fascinated by the chills they sent down her spine. But tonight, something felt off. There was a strange energy in the air, a quiet tension she couldn't quite place. As she rinsed her mouth and wiped her face with a towel, Ava glanced at the mirror again, and her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection didn't move. It stood there, staring back at her, eyes locked onto hers, while she remained motionless. Panic surged through her as she dropped the towel, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, hoping it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, her reflection still hadn't moved. It was frozen in place, hands gripping the edge of the sink, eyes unblinking. Ava's pulse quickened, a familiar sense of dread creeping up her spine. It reminded her of the unsettling stories she'd read about mirrors, about reflections that weren't quite right, about scary stories to tell where things in mirrors took on a life of their own. But this was different. This wasn't fiction. This was happening right now. She stepped back, her hands trembling as she stared at the mirror. Her reflection stayed put, watching her with an intensity that made her feel like a trapped animal. It was like something out of a slasher novel, the kind where every movement felt dangerous, every choice had deadly consequences. Is this real? She whispered to herself, barely able to process what she was seeing. Suddenly, her reflection smiled. Ava gasped, stumbling backward, her heart racing. The smile was wrung too wide, too sinister. like a distorted version of her own expression. The reflection's eyes gleamed with something dark, something malicious. It felt like the reflection was alive, mocking her from the other side of the glass. With a shaky hand, she reached toward the mirror, hesitating just inches from the surface. Was this some kind of hallucination? Had she been reading too many short horror stories to read online, letting her imagination run wild? But as her fingers neared the glass, the reflection moved on its own, mirroring her movements exactly. The smile never wavered. Ava pulled her hand back, fear clawing at her chest. She had to get out of the bathroom, out of the apartment. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but there were no answers. Just the overwhelming terror that something had taken her place in the mirror. She bolted for the door, flinging it open and rushing into the hallway. Her heart pounded in her ears as she ran toward the living room, desperate to put distance between herself and the mirror. But as she reached the doorway, something caught her eye. Another mirror, this one hanging above the fireplace. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to look, terrified of what she might see. The room reflected back at her, empty and still. She exhaled, relief flooding her body as she realized there was no twisted version of her lurking in this mirror. But then, the reflection moved. Ava's heart stopped as she watched her reflection step out from behind the hallway wall, entering the room. She hadn't moved an inch, yet there it was her double, staring back at her from the mirror, mimicking the very fear she felt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands shaking. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Do you like what you see?" Ava's blood ran cold. How was this happening? Who could have sent that message? She glanced around the room, the oppressive silence closing in on her. The reflection in the mirror smiled again, a grin that didn't belong to her. Another message buzzed through. "I'm closer than you think." Ava backed away from the mirror, her pulse racing as the reflection stepped closer to the glass, as if trying to break through. The smile widened, and the reflection tilted its head, like a predator toying with its prey. "Who are you?" Ava whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection's eyes gleamed in response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Ava's breath hitched as the silence thickened around her. In the darkness, she could feel it, the presence of her reflection, watching her, waiting. Her phone buzzed one more time. "Turn around." Terror gripped her chest as she stood frozen in place. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to know what was standing behind her. But the pressure was overwhelming, the feeling of eyes boring into her back. Slowly, with shaking hands, Ava turned. There, just inches away from her, stood the reflection. It wasn't in the mirror anymore. Ava screamed, stumbling back as the reflection took a step forward, its smile stretching impossibly wide. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, revealing the twisted version of herself standing in the middle of the room, staring at her with empty eyes. Then, the lights went out again. Ava's scream echoed through the apartment, swallowed by the darkness. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if your reflection didn't move with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about this terrifying twist. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, be sure to subscribe for more creepy tales that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It was past midnight when Connor heard the noises again. He had been trying to focus on his work, but the persistent sound from the basement kept pulling his attention away. At first he thought it was just the creaky old house settling, but this was different. It was faint, like a whisper, a low, murmuring voice that seemed to rise up through the floorboards. Sitting in his study, Connor strained to listen, but the sound was too soft to make out clearly. He glanced over at the door leading to the basement, a creeping sense of dread washing over him. It reminded him of the good horror novels he loved reading, the ones where the protagonist starts to notice little things out of place, leading to something far worse. The house had always been quiet, almost too quiet, and ever since he'd moved in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His friends had joked that it was haunted, feeding into his love for scary short stories to read online, but Connor had always shrugged it off. Ghosts weren't real, and old houses made noises. Simple as that. Or so he thought. Tonight, though, the sounds were different, persistent. It wasn't just random creaks or groans from the old pipes. It was almost like the conversation. He stood up, curiosity getting the better of him, and slowly made his way to the basement door. The air in the house felt heavier as he approached, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The basement had always made him uneasy. It was unfinished, cold, and damp, the kind of place where the walls seemed to absorb the darkness. But tonight there was something more, a palpable sense of fear. Connor hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He'd read enough scary stories to tell to know that this was the part where things usually took a turn for the worse. But this was real life. And real life wasn't like a slasher novel where the danger was always lurking just around the corner. Right? Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. The cool, musty air from the basement hit him as he flicked on the light. The single bulb at the top of the stairs cast long shadows over the concrete steps. Slowly, Connor descended, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices grew louder. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused, listening intently. It was clearer now, two voices, speaking in hushed tones, though the words were indistinguishable. Connor's pulse quickened as he scanned the basement, his eyes darting to every dark corner. But it was empty. There was no one there. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the dim light. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Are you alone?" Connor's breath caught in his throat. He glanced around the empty basement, the cold seeping into his bones. His fingers trembled as he typed a response. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You shouldn't have gone down there." Connor's heart pounded in his ears. He backed up toward the stairs, his eyes locked on the shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. The air in the basement felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was closing in on him. His phone buzzed again. "They're watching you." A chill ran down his spine as he slowly turned, his gaze falling on the far corner of the basement. There, in the shadows, something moved. His breath caught as he stared into the darkness, the low murmur of voices growing louder, more insistent. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. His phone buzzed again, and though he didn't want to look, he couldn't stop himself. "Don't turn around." Connor's hands shook as he turned back toward the stairs. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to run, but he felt paralyzed. The voices were clearer now, though he still couldn't understand the words. It felt like a conversation happening just out of reach, like something from one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the true horror wasn't what you saw but what you felt. Suddenly, the light above him flickered and went out, plunging the basement into complete darkness. Connor's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, using the faint light from the screen to see. His hand brushed against the cold cement wall as he tried to find the stairs. His breath came in short, panic bursts as the voices surrounded him, whispering from every corner of the room. His phone buzzed one last time, and with trembling hands he glanced at the screen. "They're behind you." Connor froze. Every instinct told him not to look, not to turn around, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly he turned his head, the faint glow from his phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. There, standing at the bottom of the stairs, were two figures. They were barely visible in the dim light, their outlines faint and hazy. But Connor could see their faces pale, with empty eyes that stared straight at him. His heart pounded as he stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone. The figures didn't move, but their presence filled the room, oppressive and terrifying. Connor turned and bolted up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't stop until he was back in the safety of his living room, slamming the basement door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, his eyes locked on the door. The voices had stopped. His phone buzzed again. "You shouldn't have left." Connor's hands shook as he stared at the message, his mind racing. What had he just seen? Were they still down there, waiting for him to return? He glanced at the basement door, the feeling of dread still heavy in the air. He wasn't going back down there, not tonight, maybe not ever. If this story made you think twice about your basement, don't forget to like this video. Have you ever heard something you couldn't explain? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to hear your stories. And if you're a fan of scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more eerie tales. There's always something waiting in the dark. Leah had always hated the attic. Growing up, she avoided it at all costs, its dusty corners and dark shadows fueling her childhood imagination. Even as an adult, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to the place. But when her parents passed away and left her the family home, it became her responsibility to clean it out. One rainy afternoon, Leah found herself standing at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up at the darkened space. The flashlight in her hand flickered slightly as she took a deep breath and climbed the creaky wooden steps. The attic was exactly as she remembered it, cobwebbed and cluttered, filled with old boxes, forgotten memories, and the strange sense that she wasn't alone. The room was thick with dust, the air stale and heavy. Leah's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old furniture, picture frames, and family heirlooms. She had come to clean things out, but now, standing here, all she could think about were the scary short stories to read online she'd been obsessed with lately. Those stories always had attics dark, forgotten places where things that shouldn't exist lurked in the shadows. As she rummaged through the boxes, Leah stumbled upon something unexpected, an old porcelain doll, tucked away in the corner of the attic, its lifeless eyes staring up at her. The doll was dressed in an antique lace gown, its face cracked in several places. A shiver ran down Leah's spine as she stared at it. She didn't remember ever owning a doll like this. She picked it up carefully, the porcelain cold and unsettling to the touch. The doll's expression was blank, but its eyes seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. It reminded her of the scary stories to tell she'd read growing up, the kind where cursed objects always carried a dark history with them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered again, casting long, strange shadows across the attic. Leah felt a chill creep up her arms, and for a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, the doll still clutched in her hands. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling in the empty attic. There was no reply, just silence. Leah shook her head, trying to calm her nerves. It was an old house, of course it would make noises. She was just letting her imagination get the better of her. She had been reading too many good horror novels, and now her mind was playing tricks. But the doll felt heavy in her hands, too real, too cold. She placed it back in the corner and quickly moved to another box, hoping to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her. An hour later, Leah had barely made a dent in the clutter. The rain outside had intensified, the sound of it pounding against the roof. She decided to take a break, heading downstairs to make herself some tea. But as she left the attic, she glanced back at the doll one more time, its cracked face barely visible in the fading light. Something about it seemed wrong, like it was waiting for her to leave. In the kitchen, the warmth of the tea calmed her nerves. She sat by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets, the sound oddly soothing. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe the attic was just as creepy as she remembered, and her mind had filled in the rest. But then her phone buzzed. Leah glanced down, expecting a message from a friend, but her stomach dropped when she saw the text. "Why did you leave me?" The number was unknown. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the message, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? No one knew she was at the house, and even if they did, who would send such a message? Her fingers trembled as she typed back. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "Come back." Leah's pulse quickened as dread settled over her. She stood up from the table, her eyes drifting toward the door that led back upstairs. Every part of her wanted to ignore the text, to leave the attic alone, but she couldn't. Something was drawing her back. Against her better judgment, Leah climbed the stairs again, her hand shaking as she reached for the attic door. It creaked open, revealing the dim, cluttered room once more. The air felt colder than before, the shadows longer and more menacing. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The doll was gone. Leah's breath caught in her throat as her flashlight swept the room, searching for the porcelain figure. But it was nowhere to be seen. She had left it right there. In the corner, she was sure of it. Her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. I'm waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned, her flashlight shaking in her hand. There, at the top of the stairs, the doll sat, its cracked face turned toward her, its blank eyes gleaming in the dim light. Leah stumbled backward, her pulse racing. She didn't know how the doll had moved, but she wasn't going to wait to find out. She turned and ran down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps, as she bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind her. In the safety of the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, panic bursts. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed a friend. The phone rang once, twice then went to voicemail. Her phone buzzed again. Don't leave me. Leah's blood ran cold. She turned and looked at the attic door, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't going back up there. Not ever. She didn't care what was up there, but whatever it wasn't staying with her. She grabbed her keys and rushed out of the house, the rain soaking her as she sprinted to her car. As she drove away, the house disappeared into the storm, but the image of the doll stayed with her, those lifeless eyes, watching her, waiting. It was a crisp autumn morning when Megan stumbled upon the small, antique shop hidden in the back streets of her town. She had been out for a walk, enjoying the quiet, when something about the shop caught her eye. The storefront was old, with dusty windows and a sign so faded that she could barely make out the name. Intrigued, Megan decided to step inside. Her curiosity piqued. The shop was cluttered with items from another time, old furniture, tarnished silverware, and shelves filled with trinkets that looked like they had seen better days. The air smelled faintly of dust and old books. As Megan wandered through the narrow aisles, she couldn't help but feel a chill. There was something about the place that reminded her of the good horror novels she often read, where forgotten objects hid dark secrets. Then she saw it. Tucked away on a shelf, behind a stack of cracked teacups, was a delicate necklace. It was silver, with a small, ornate pendant in the shape of an eye. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt off. The way the eye seemed to stare back at her, following her every move, sent a shiver down her spine. It reminded her of the cursed objects she had read about in scary stories to read in the dark. Still, Megan was drawn to it. She picked it up carefully, the cool metal sending a chill through her fingers. As she held the necklace, the shopkeeper, a frail, elderly woman, appeared behind her, moving silently across the room. "That's a special piece," the woman said, her voice low and raspy. Megan smiled politely, but there was something unsettling about the woman's tone. "How much for the necklace?" she asked, running her fingers along the intricate design. The woman stared at Megan for a moment, her pale eyes narrowing. "It's not for sale." Megan blinked, confused. "But it's just sitting here on the shelf." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Some things are better left where they are," she said cryptically, before turning and disappearing into the back of the shop. Megan glanced down at the necklace again, her curiosity growing. She should have listened to the woman's warning, but something about the necklace called to her. Before she knew what she was doing, she slipped it into her pocket and quickly left the shop, the faint jingle of the bell above the door, the only sound behind her. That night, Megan couldn't stop thinking about the necklace. She sat on her bed, the pendant resting in her palm. The eye in the center seemed to gleam in the dim light of her room, almost like it was watching her. Despite the unease it caused, she found herself slipping it around her neck. As the cool metal touched her skin, a strange sensation washed over her, a mix of dread and curiosity, as though she had stepped into one of those short horror stories to read online, where the consequences of a single choice unfold with terrifying clarity. For the next few days, strange things began happening. It started small items in her apartment would be moved, though Megan was certain she hadn't touched them. Lights flickered whenever she entered a room, and the air around her felt colder, heavier. She brushed it off as coincidence, but deep down she knew something was wrong. The necklace grew warmer each day, as if it was alive, pulsing gently against her skin. Megan tried to take it off, but the clasp wouldn't budge. Panic started to settle in. No matter how hard she tugged, the necklace stayed in place, as if it had fused with her skin. One night, she woke suddenly to the feeling of someone watching her. Her room was bathed in shadows, and the necklace felt hot, almost burning. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and that's when she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, its face obscured by the shadows. Megan's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer. The air grew colder, and she could feel a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure's hand reached out, long and thin, and touched the pendant around her neck. "You shouldn't have taken it," a voice whispered, cold and hollow. Megan screamed, throwing herself out of bed, her hands clawing at the necklace. But it wouldn't come off. The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a suffocating silence. She stumbled toward the mirror, her fingers desperately trying to remove the necklace, but it stayed locked in place, the eyes staring back at her with a sinister glint. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, and Megan grabbed it with shaking hands. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You can't escape it." Her heart pounded as she stared at the text. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with fear. Megan grabbed her keys and rushed out of the apartment, not caring that it was the middle of the night. She needed to get away. She found herself back at the antique shop, the bell above the door ringing as she burst inside. The shop was dark, empty, the shelves filled with the same dusty trinkets. But the shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. "Please," Megan called out, her voice trembling. "I need help." The silence in the shop was deafening. She wandered through the aisles, her heart racing, her hands still tugging at the necklace. The old woman was gone, but Megan could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, just like in the scary campfire stories she had grown up hearing, where cursed objects always came with a terrible price. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen, her stomach twisting in fear. It's too late. Megan turned toward the back of the shop, and there, standing in the shadows, was the shopkeeper. The old woman's pale eyes gleamed as she stepped forward. "You should never have taken it," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "The curse is yours now." Megan's breath caught in her throat as the woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing against the pendant. The necklace grew hotter, searing Megan's skin, but she couldn't move, frozen in place by the weight of the curse. "You belong to it now," the shopkeeper said, her voice soft and full of finality. And then the lights in the shop flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Carter had lived in his new house for a few months before he discovered the hidden door. The house was old over a century, by his best guess, and full of creaky floorboards and narrow hallways that reminded him of the good horror novels he used to read. The attic was the last place he'd gotten around to exploring, but after hearing strange noises in the night, he decided to check it out. One cold Saturday afternoon, Carter pulled down the rickety attic stairs and climbed up into the dusty space. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Old furniture and trunks filled the room, their shapes hidden under yellowed sheets. As he explored, his flashlight flickered over an odd section of the wall in the far corner. The paneling didn't match the rest of the room. Curious, he ran his hand over the surface, and to his surprise, it moved. A door. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't on the house's blueprint. There was no mention of a secret room. It reminded him of one of those scary short stories to read online, where a hidden door leads to something terrible, something that should have stayed hidden. Carter hesitated before opening it. The air felt heavier now, like something was waiting behind that door. He almost turned back but couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. His fingers fumbled with the latch, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage leading into darkness. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped inside, the musty air thick with dust. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the narrow corridor. At the end of the passage was a small room, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were lined with old wallpaper, faded and peeling, and the only thing inside was a single wooden chair in the center of the room. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The room felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The air was colder here, the silence almost deafening. He shone his flashlight over the walls, searching for any clue as to why the room had been hidden away. But there was nothing, just the chair, sitting there like a forgotten memory. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "Why did you open it?" Carter's blood ran cold. He spun around, shining his flashlight back toward the door, but the attic was empty. The passageway loomed behind him, dark and silent. He swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart. This had to be a prank. Someone was messing with him. He typed a quick reply, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You shouldn't be here." Carter's pulse quickened. He backed out of the room, his flashlight flickering as he made his way down the narrow passage. His mind raced, filled with the eerie tales from scary campfire stories he'd heard as a kid about people who opened doors that should have stayed locked, only to unleash something they couldn't escape. As he reached the attic, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Carter jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed toward the attic stairs, but before he could leave, his phone buzzed again. "Stay." Carter froze, his hand on the railing. The attic felt darker now, the air colder. He turned back to the hidden door, half expecting it to swing open again, but it stayed shut. His mind raced with possibilities. Was someone inside the house with him? Had someone been living in that room? Or was it something worse? The old stories about haunted houses came rushing back, scary stories to read in the dark where forgotten rooms held more than just old furniture. He had always laughed them off, but now, standing alone in the attic, he wasn't so sure. His phone buzzed again, the screen casting an eerie glow in the dim attic. "Look behind you." Carter's blood ran cold. Every instinct told him not to turn around, not to look. But the pull was too strong. Slowly he turned his head, his flashlight shaking in his hand. There, standing at the far end of the attic, was a figure. It was barely visible in the shadows, but Carter could see enough to make his heart stop. The figure was tall, its outline faint and hazy, but its eyes were glowing, staring at him from across the room. Carter stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. His hands shook as he fumbled for the attic stairs, his mind screaming at him to run. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. His phone buzzed one last time. He should never have opened the door. That was all the encouragement Carter needed. He turned and bolted down the attic stairs, slamming the hatch shut behind him. His heart raced as he locked the door, leaning against the wall as his breath came in short, panic bursts. He wasn't going back up there. Whatever was in that room, whatever he had disturbed, it wasn't leaving him alone. The house felt different now, as if the darkness from the attic had seeped into every corner. His phone buzzed again, and though every part of him didn't want to look, he forced himself to check the screen. "I'm still here." Carter's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the message, his hands trembling. He glanced toward the attic door, the sense of dread growing with each passing second. He wasn't alone, not anymore. It had been a long week, and all Ava wanted was a quiet evening at home. She loved her apartment nestled in the heart of the city, with large windows that overlooked the quiet street below. The soft hum of cars and the glow of streetlights gave her a sense of comfort. It was the perfect place to unwind with a good book. Tonight, she had planned to start one of the good horror novels she'd recently picked up, the kind that sent chills down her spine, keeping her awake long into the night. As she settled into her couch, blanket wrapped around her, Ava opened her book. The night outside was still, and the only sound in the apartment was the rustling of pages. But as she read, her attention kept drifting to the window. It wasn't like her to feel uneasy, but something about the night felt off, as if the silence was too perfect. She shrugged it off, telling herself she had been reading too many scary short stories to read online lately. The mind had a way of playing tricks when it was filled with dark thoughts. But as the night wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, Ava would glance up from her book, her eyes drawn to the window, expecting to see something or someone there. It wasn't until she heard the soft tap on the glass that her heart truly skipped a beat. Ava froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tap came again, soft but insistent, like a faint knock. Slowly, she turned her head, eyes locked on the window. Nothing, just the empty street and the dim glow of the streetlights. She laughed nervously to herself. It had to be the wind, she thought. Or maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the window. She grabbed it, expecting a text from a friend, but what she saw made her stomach twist. Look outside. The message was from an unknown number. Ava's heart raced as she stared at the screen. Her hands trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm outside your window." Ava's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted to the window, but there was no one there. Just the empty street, the quiet night. She stood up from the couch, her body tense as she slowly approached the glass. Every step felt heavier, the silence of the apartment now suffocating. She peered outside, her breath fogging up the glass, but the street was empty. Relief washed over her, and she exhaled, laughing at her own paranoia. She had been reading too many scary stories to tell the kind where the protagonist always saw things that weren't there. But just as she turned to walk away, she saw it. A face. It was faint, just barely visible in the reflection of the window, but it was there staring at her from the street below. Ava's heart stopped. The face was pale, its eyes wide and unblinking. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the street was empty. The face was gone. Her phone buzzed again. "Did you see me?" Ava's hands shook as she typed back, her breath coming in short gasps. "Who are you?" The reply was immediate. "I'm watching you." Panic surged through her as she backed away from the window, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but before she could dial, another message appeared. "Don't bother. I'm closer than you think." Ava's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Was someone in the apartment? How had they seen her from the street? She raced to the front door, checking the locks. Everything was secure, but it didn't matter. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm inside." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back from the door, her mind screaming at her to leave, to get out. But her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She glanced at the window again, her heart pounding in her ears. And then she saw it. The face was in the window again, but this time it was clearer, closer. It wasn't outside, it was inside, staring at her from just beyond the glass. Ava's scream echoed through the apartment as she turned and bolted toward the hallway. Her hands fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The lights stayed off, the darkness swallowing her whole. She could feel it now, someone watching her, someone standing just out of sight. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Look behind you." Ava froze, her heart racing. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to know what was there, but the pull was too strong. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes wide with fear. There, standing in the darkness behind her, was the figure. The same pale face, the same wide, unblinking eyes. It stood motionless, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Ava's breath hitched in her throat as she backed away, her hands trembling. But no matter how far she moved, the figure stayed where it was, its eyes locked onto hers. And then, without warning, it smiled. It had been years since Emma had returned to her grandparents' old house, deep in the countryside. The place had been left abandoned after their passing, sitting untouched, a forgotten relic of her childhood. The house was large and creaky, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that seemed to watch the fields outside. Emma had always been curious about the house's history, but there was one room that had remained locked for as long as she could remember. Her grandparents had always warned her not to go near at the door at the end of the second-floor hallway. "That room stays closed," they'd say, and she had never dared to ask why. But now, with no one left to tell her otherwise, Emma was determined to find out what was behind the door. The house groaned under the weight of the wind as Emma explored the upstairs, her flashlight casting long shadows on the old wallpaper. The place had been left exactly as it was when her grandparents lived, their furniture draped in sheets, dust thick on every surface. It reminded her of the eerie good horror novels she loved, the ones that made her heart race with each turn of the page. She made her way to the end of the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she stood before the door. It was just as she remembered, old, painted white, and strangely out of place compared to the rest of the house. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. What could be behind it? Her imagination had run wild over the years, fueled by the scary stories to read in the dark she devoured. Taking a deep breath, Emma turned the knob. To her surprise, the door opened easily, the hinges creaking loudly as it swung inward. The room beyond was dark, and a rush of cold air sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the space. The room was empty, no furniture, no decorations, just a small window at the far end, covered in dust. But something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling energy. It was as if the room had been waiting for her. As she shone her flashlight around, something on the floor caught her eye. There, in the middle of the room, was a single object, a key, old and tarnished, lying in the dust. Emma's pulse quickened as she bent down to pick it up. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma jumped, her heart racing as she spun around. The door was closed, and the room had grown even colder. She rushed to the door, her hands fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pulled harder, but it was no use. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't have opened it." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was someone watching her? She backed away from the door, her flashlight flickering in the dim light. Another buzz. "You need to leave." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around the room. There was no one there, just the empty space, cold and suffocating. She rushed back to the door, banging on it with her fist, but the wood didn't give. Her hands shook as she tried the knob again, but it was still stuck. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down, dread washing over her. "I'm in the room." Emma froze, her body going cold. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight trembling as she swept it across the empty room. But it wasn't empty anymore. There, standing in the corner, was a figure. It was barely visible in the faint light, but it was there, tall, shadowy, and watching her. Emma's breath hitched as she stumbled back, her pulse racing. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, like something out of one of those scary short stories to read online that always left her feeling unsettled. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, its eyes glinting in the dark, watching her. Emma's phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She was frozen, her back pressed against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It took one step forward, then another, its eyes never leaving hers. Emma's breath came in short, panic bursts as she reached for the door again, pulling desperately at the knob. But it wouldn't open. Her phone buzzed once more, the screen glowing in the darkness. "Don't turn around." Emma's blood ran cold. She was trapped, the figure drawing closer with each passing second. She could feel the weight of its gaze, the oppressive presence pressing down on her. Suddenly, the door behind her gave way, swinging open with a loud creak. Emma didn't hesitate. She bolted out of the room, her feet barely touching the floor as she raced down the hallway. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the stairs, practically throwing herself down them. As she reached the bottom, she glanced back at the hallway. The door at the end was closed again, the figure nowhere to be seen. But the house felt different now, darker, more sinister. Her phone buzzed one final time, and she glanced down at the screen, her hands shaking. "I'll be waiting." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed her keys and fled the house, the old wooden door slamming shut behind her. She didn't look back as she drove away, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't done with her. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a weekend getaway for a group of friends. Lauren, Nick, and Beth had been planning the trip for months, excited to spend a few days in the wilderness, away from the noise and stress of city life. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from any main roads, with nothing but towering trees and a small lake nearby. It sounded like the perfect place to unwind. But as the sun began to set on their first night, a strange sense of unease settled over the camp. Lauren had always been the adventurous type, a fan of good horror novels and scary stories to read in the dark. She loved the thrill of the unknown, the idea that something might be lurking just beyond the firelight. But tonight, something about the woods felt wrong. The trees seemed too tall, the darkness too deep. It was the kind of setting that reminded her of those scary campfire stories where the danger is always closer than you think. Nick tossed another log onto the fire, sending sparks up into the night sky. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, noticing the way Lauren stared out into the darkness. She shrugged, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess. The woods are a little creepy at night." Beth, always the practical one, rolled her eyes. "It's just your imagination, Lauren. You've been reading too many horror stories." Lauren laughed, but her unease didn't fade. As the fire crackled, she kept glancing toward the tree line, feeling like something was watching them. The air was still too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the forest chirping insects and rustling leaves were absent. And then she saw him. At first she thought it was a trick of the firelight, but there, just beyond the trees, stood a figure. Tall, dark, barely visible in the shadows. Lauren's heart skipped a beat as she stared, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Do you guys see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nick and Beth looked up, following her gaze. But the figure was gone. "See what?" Nick asked, frowning. "There was someone out there," Lauren insisted, her voice rising. "I saw someone standing by the trees." Beth sighed. "It's probably just another camper. There are other people around, you know." But Lauren wasn't convinced. The figure had been too still, too quiet. It hadn't moved like a normal person. It had just stood there, watching. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away from the dark woods. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I'm watching you." Lauren's stomach twisted with fear. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the message, her mind racing. She looked up at Nick and Beth, but they were talking quietly, oblivious to the growing sense of dread that was gripping her. She quickly typed a reply, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "I'm closer than you think." Lauren's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around the campsite, the firelight casting long shadows over the tents and trees. Her hands trembled as she shoved her phone back into her pocket, trying to push down the rising panic. "Maybe we should pack up and leave in the morning," she suggested, her voice shaky. Nick raised an eyebrow. "Leave? We just got here." Beth sighed again, but before she could say anything, the sound of a twig snapping echoed from the trees. All three of them froze, their eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. There was a soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Nick stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. Lauren's heart raced as the footsteps stopped. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the figure again, just a glimpse of movement in the trees. "We should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nick laughed nervously. "It's probably just some animal. Relax." But Lauren couldn't relax. Something was out there, watching them. She could feel it. Her phone buzzed again, and she hesitated before pulling it out. "I don't turn around." Her blood ran cold. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was behind her. But she couldn't help herself. Slowly she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing just beyond the trees, was the figure. It was closer now, its face still hidden in the shadows, but its eyes gleamed in the firelight. Lauren gasped, stumbling backward, her breath coming in short, panic bursts. "We need to go. Now." Nick and Beth finally seemed to sense the urgency in her voice. Nick grabbed his backpack, throwing it over his shoulder. "All right, let's go. This place is giving me the creeps." They quickly packed up their gear, the fire still crackling behind them. As they made their way toward the car, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following them, lurking just beyond the light of their flashlights. Her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands, she checked the message. "I'm right behind you." Lauren's breath hitched as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed darker now, the path ahead twisting into the unknown. They reached the car, tossing their bags into the trunk. As Nick fumbled with the keys, Lauren's phone buzzed one final time. "You can't leave." Panic surged through her as the engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite behind. The figure was gone, but the dread stayed with her, clinging to her like a shadow. Whatever had been watching them in the woods wasn't gone, and deep down, Lauren knew it wasn't done with them. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if you saw someone watching you in the woods? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle this creepy situation. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales that will keep you up at night. There's always something lurking in the shadows. It was nearing midnight when Claire first heard the knock. She had been curled up on her couch, watching an old horror movie with the lights off. The steady hum of the rain outside had been lulling her into a relaxed state when the sharp sound snapped her back to reality. 3 distinct knocks echoed from the front door, quick and deliberate. Claire paused the movie, frowning. Who could be knocking at this hour? She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where unexpected visitors after dark were unheard of. The feeling in the pit of her stomach reminded her of the good horror novels she loved reading, where innocent noises often led to terrifying discoveries. She stood up slowly, her heart beginning to race as she walked toward the front door. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of her TV. Another knock sounded 3 times, just like before. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there. Claire's mind raced. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some teenagers were messing around, trying to scare her. She shook her head, laughing nervously to herself. She had been reading too many scary stories to tell her imagination was getting the better of her. But even as she tried to shake off the fear, a chill ran down her spine. Something about this didn't feel right. She locked the door and turned back toward the living room. But before she could take another step, there was a third knock, this time louder, more urgent. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Let me in. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the message, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Who was texting her? Who was at her door? Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "I'm outside." Panic surged through her as she glanced toward the door. She moved quickly to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, rain softly falling under the glow of the streetlights. No one was there. Her phone buzzed again. Look again. Claire's blood ran cold. She backed away from the window, her pulse racing. There was no one outside. She was sure of it. But the messages, they kept coming. She locked the door, double-checking it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Another knock. This time it wasn't from the front door. It came from the back of the house. Claire spun around, her mind racing. The back door. She hadn't checked it. Her heart pounded as she ran to the kitchen, flicking on the lights. The rain tapped against the windows, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the house. She reached the back door, her hands shaking as she peered through the small window. Her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the backyard, was a figure. It was tall, its face obscured by the shadows, standing perfectly still in the rain. Claire's pulse quickened as she stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. Let me in. Claire's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen in place. Who was this person? How had they found her? She had never seen anyone like this before. But there was something about the figure that felt familiar, like a forgotten face from a distant nightmare. The figure took a step closer to the door. Claire backed away, her breath coming in panic bursts. She grabbed her phone and typed frantically, "What do you want?" The reply came instantly. "You invited me." Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. Invited? What was this person talking about? She had never invited anyone over. She glanced at the figure again. It was closer now, just a few feet from the door. She could feel the dread settling over her, cold and suffocating. The house, once her refuge, now felt like a trap. Her phone buzzed once more. "I'm coming in." The scream caught in Claire's throat as she bolted for the living room, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. She dialed 911, her fingers trembling so badly that she almost dropped the phone. The line rang once, twice before cutting out completely. The lights flickered. The knocking came again this time, from the front door. Claire's mind raced as she backed into the living room, her eyes darting from the front door to the windows. The figure had disappeared from the backyard, but she knew it was still there, waiting. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Her phone buzzed again, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. She glanced at the screen, her hands trembling. "I'm inside." Claire's breath hitched as she turned, her eyes scanning the room. The house was silent, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. She could feel it, the presence, the weight of unseen eyes, lurking just beyond her vision. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the darkened TV screen, standing just behind her, was the figure. Her scream echoed through the house as she stumbled away, her heart pounding in her ears. But when she turned, the figure was gone. The house was silent again, the only sound the soft tapping of the rain against the windows. Her phone buzzed one final time. "I'm here now." Ethan had always been a night owl, often finding himself deep in thought while everyone else was asleep. Tonight he sat at his desk, the only light in the room coming from the small lamp by his side. His apartment was quiet, the hum of the city far below barely reaching him. Ethan liked these moments where it was just him, his thoughts, and the occasional good horror novel to pass the time. But tonight, something was different. He couldn't stop staring at the drawer in his desk. It was the bottom drawer, always locked, and as far as Ethan knew, he didn't have the key. It had come with the desk when he bought it secondhand, and he'd never thought much of it. But lately, the drawer had been on his mind. For weeks now, every time he sat at his desk, he found himself glancing at it, wondering what was inside. It reminded him of one of those scary stories to tell, where something seemingly innocent turns into a gateway to something far more sinister. Tonight, the curiosity was too much to resist. Ethan got up from his chair and rummaged through his drawers, searching for anything that might open the lock. He tried a few paper clips, the tip of a knife, even an old bobby pin, but nothing worked. Frustrated, he sat back down, staring at the drawer as if willing it to open. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed on the desk. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Don't open it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, confused. Who would send something like that? His eyes darted around the room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. His apartment was empty. He was alone. He typed back quickly, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's locked for a reason." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He glanced back at the drawer, his mind racing. Was someone watching him? His apartment was on the 5th floor, far above the street below, but the message felt too personal, too timely. Suddenly, the drawer rattled. Ethan jumped, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes locked onto the desk, watching as the drawer shook slightly, as if something inside was trying to get out. The rattling stopped as quickly as it had started, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air. His phone buzzed again. Leave it alone. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the drawer, ignoring the warning. His curiosity was too strong now, and he had to know what was inside. He grabbed a small hammer from his toolkit, and with one swift movement, broke the lock. The drawer creaked as it slid open, revealing its contents. Inside was a small, black notebook, worn and faded with age. Ethan's pulse quickened as he picked it up, the pages crinkling under his fingers. The book felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in a freezer rather than a desk drawer. He flipped it open, expecting to find notes, sketches, something mundane. But instead, the pages were filled with strange symbols written in black ink, each one more intricate than the last. The handwriting was frantic, almost desperate, as if whoever had written it had been in a rush or worse, terrified. His phone buzzed again, and with shaking hands, he checked the message. "You shouldn't have done that." Ethan's heart raced as he glanced around the room. The air felt colder now, thicker, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the past few minutes. His breath fogged in front of him as he stared at the notebook, the symbols seeming to shift and move on the page, even though he wasn't turning it. The lights in his apartment flickered. Suddenly, a loud knock came from the front door. Ethan jumped to his feet, his mind racing. Who could be knocking at this hour? He grabbed his phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The message on the screen made his blood run cold. "Don't answer." His hands trembled as the knocking continued, louder and more insistent this time. Ethan backed away from the door, his pulse racing. He glanced at the notebook still lying on the desk, its pages now open to a symbol he hadn't seen before. It was larger than the others, more complex, and as he stared at it, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's phone buzzed again. "I'm here." His breath hitched as he backed further into the room, his eyes darting between the door and the notebook. The air was thick with dread, the temperature so cold now that he could see his breath hanging in the air. Suddenly the lights flickered again, and with a loud pop, the bulb in his lamp went out, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed his phone, using the screen to cast a faint light across the room. The notebook lay open on the desk, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of breathing. Ethan froze, his eyes wide as he slowly turned toward the sound. There, in the shadows, he saw a figure, barely visible, its face obscured by the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was toying with him. His phone buzzed again. Too late. The figure moved closer, its face coming into view pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Ethan backed up against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure reached out a hand toward the desk, toward the notebook. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent again, the air still heavy with the weight of whatever had just happened. Ethan's phone buzzed one final time, and with trembling hands he looked at the screen. You belong to it now. His breath hitched as he stared at the message. He glanced at the notebook, the strange symbols still glowing faintly on the page. Whatever he had unlocked, whatever he had disturbed, wasn't done with him. Olivia had never been particularly superstitious, but there was something about mirrors that unsettled her. Growing up, her grandmother had always told her not to stare into the mirror for too long at night. They show more than just your reflection, she would say with a serious look in her eyes. Olivia had always laughed it off, attributing her grandmother's warnings to old folklore. But tonight, alone in her new apartment, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The mirror in her bedroom was an antique, left behind by the previous tenants. It stood tall and ornate, its edges framed with intricate carvings. Olivia had planned to replace it, but the mirror had a strange allure, and she never got around to it. Now, as she got ready for bed, the mirror seemed to take on a life of its own, reflecting more than just her image. The apartment was quiet, the night outside still, but something about the reflection caught her eye. For a split second, Olivia thought she saw movement in the mirror, like a shadow passing behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She laughed nervously to herself, brushing it off as her imagination. She had been reading too many scary short stories to read online, filling her head with ideas of haunted objects and eerie reflections. Still, as she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her attention away from the mirror. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but her stomach tightened when she saw the message. Don't look into the mirror. The message came from an unknown number. Olivia's pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. Her eyes darted to the mirror, and a chill ran down her spine. How could someone know? She typed back quickly, her hands shaking. Who is this? The reply came almost immediately. Don't turn around. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the phone. She slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto the mirror. There, standing in the reflection, was a shadowy figure. It was faint, almost invisible in the dim light of the room, but it was there standing right behind her. Olivia's blood ran cold as she spun around, expecting to see someone in her bedroom. But the room was empty. Her phone buzzed again. I'm still here. Olivia's heart raced as she backed up against the wall, her eyes darting between the mirror and her phone. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she typed back, "What do you want?" The reply was instant. Watch the mirror. Her pulse quickened as she forced herself to look at the mirror again. This time the reflection was different. The room behind her looked darker, the shadows longer, more menacing. And then she saw the figure again, but closer now, its outline barely visible in the darkness. Olivia's breath hitched as she stepped back, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. Don't run. Panic surged through her as she bolted for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. She threw open the door and rushed into the hallway, her heart racing as she made her way to the living room. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, and then went silent. Her phone buzzed one more time. You can't escape. Olivia's blood ran cold as she backed away from the front door, her mind racing. She glanced down the hallway toward her bedroom, the open door casting an eerie shadow on the floor. The mirror loomed just beyond the doorway, its surface dark and menacing. And then, from the darkness, she saw it. The figure stepped out of the reflection, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as it moved closer, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the door. But the figure was faster. It was right behind her now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't need to look. I'm here. Olivia's scream echoed through the empty apartment as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. After moving into her new apartment, Mia was excited to finally have a place of her own. The building was old, with high ceilings, wooden floors, and vintage fixtures that gave it a classic charm. It was perfect, or so she thought. The first few weeks were peaceful enough. Mia spent her time decorating, unpacking boxes, and settling into her new life. But soon, strange things started to happen. It began with the noises. At first, it was just faint scratching sounds at night. Mia brushed it off as the building settling, or maybe the sound of a mouse in the walls. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving inside the walls. It reminded her of the good horror novels she loved, where the protagonist hears something no one else can explain, something that shouldn't be there. One night, as she lay in bed, Mia heard it again scratching, followed by a soft whisper. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to hear. The whisper was faint, almost like it was calling her name. She shook her head, telling herself she was imagining it. She had been reading too many scary short stories to read online, filling her mind with eerie ideas. But as the night went on, the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. The next day, Mia told herself it had just been a bad dream. The old building had its quirks, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She went about her day, trying to forget about the strange sounds. But as the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, the whisper returned. It was clearer this time. Mia. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes darting around the empty space. The whisper seemed to come from the walls, but how could that be possible? Her pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, filling the room with a strange, suffocating presence. Mia grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed her friend, Sarah. She needed someone to talk to, someone to tell her she wasn't going crazy. Hey Mia, what's up? Sarah answered cheerfully. There's something in my apartment, Mia whispered, glancing around the room. I think I'm hearing voices. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Voices? Like someone in your apartment? No, not like that, Mia replied, her voice shaking. It's coming from the walls. Sarah laughed, clearly not taking her seriously. You've been reading too many scary stories to tell, Mia. Old buildings make noises. It's probably just the pipes. Mia forced a laugh, trying to calm herself down. Yeah, maybe. But as she hung up, the whisper came again, louder this time. Mia, I'm waiting. Her phone buzzed in her hand, making her jump. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Listen closely. Mia's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Behind you." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly she turned, her breath catching as she stared at the wall behind her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from inside the walls themselves. Suddenly the scratching started again, louder this time, like something was trying to claw its way out. Mia stumbled back, her heart racing as she stared at the wall. The whispering grew clearer, forming words that chilled her to the bone. "Let me out." Her hands shook as she grabbed a chair, pressing her ear to the wall, desperate to understand what was happening. The voice was faint but unmistakable. "Let me out, Mia." Panic surged through her as she backed away from the wall. This wasn't normal. This wasn't her imagination. She needed to get out of the apartment. She grabbed her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. "Don't leave." Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the message. She backed toward the front door, her hand reaching for the doorknob, but the voice stopped her. "If you leave, I'll follow." Her breath hitched as she stood frozen in place. The voice was right behind her now, louder, more menacing. "Let me out." Mia grabbed her keys and bolted for the door, her pulse racing as she flung it open and ran into the hallway. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she made her way down the stairs and out into the street. The cold night air hit her like a wave, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her phone buzzed again, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. "I'm still here." Mia's heart sank. She glanced up at the building, her apartment window looming above her like a dark, ominous eye. The whisper was still there, faint but unmistakable, following her even now. She couldn't escape it. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Leah found the photograph. She had been cleaning out her grandmother's attic, sorting through old boxes of memories that had been tucked away for years. The room smelled of dust and time, filled with old books, furniture, and forgotten treasures. Leah had always loved exploring the attic as a child, but today there was something different in the air, something heavy, like the weight of forgotten stories. As she sorted through the dusty boxes, one item caught her attention. It was an old photo album, its cover worn and frayed with age. She flipped through the pages, smiling at the faded black and white pictures of family gatherings, old houses, and moments long past. But then, toward the back of the album, she found a photograph she didn't recognize. The photo was of her grandmother's house, the one she was standing in now. But something was off. In the picture, there was a person standing in the window, staring out at the camera. The figure was blurry, almost like a shadow, but it sent a chill down Leah's spine. She didn't remember anyone living in the house at the time the photo was taken. The figure's face was obscured, but its presence felt undeniable. Leah held the photo closer, her heart beginning to race. The more she stared at it, the more unsettled she became. It was like something in the picture was watching her, even now, decades after it was taken. It reminded her of the eerie, scary short stories to read online, where old photographs held dark secrets. Her phone buzzed on the attic floor beside her, startling her. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Do you see me?" Leah's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. How could someone know about the photo? She hadn't told anyone she was cleaning the attic, let alone that she had found the picture. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm in the house." Leah's blood ran cold. She looked around the dusty attic, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was quiet, too quiet. She could hear the soft patter of rain on the roof, but otherwise there was nothing. No creaking floorboards, no distant voices, just silence. Suddenly the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on her. She typed back again, her hands shaking. "Where?" Another buzz. "Look in the photo." Leah's breath hitched as she glanced down at the photograph again. The figure in the window seemed clearer now, more defined. It was no longer a blurry silhouette. She could make out its face, a pale, hollow-eyed figure staring directly at her. Her stomach twisted with fear. She quickly dropped the photo, backing away from it as if it might leap off the page. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't want to look. She couldn't. But her curiosity got the better of her. "Come find me." Leah's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed the photo album and rushed down the attic stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. She had to get out of the house. Whatever was in the photo, whatever was watching her, it wasn't safe. She ran into the living room, her mind racing, but as she reached for her coat, her phone buzzed one more time. Too late. Leah's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway of the living room, was the figure from the photograph. Its face was exactly as she had seen in the picture, pale, hollow-eyed, with an expression that sent a wave of terror through her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at her with those lifeless eyes. Leah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her ears. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to type, but before she could, the lights in the house flickered. The figure was closer now. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she backed into the corner of the room, her eyes locked onto the figure. It was still moving, slowly but deliberately, its gaze never leaving hers. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The house was silent again, but the sense of dread hung in the air, suffocating. Leah stood frozen in place, her mind racing. Was it gone for good, or was it still watching her? Her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands she looked at the screen. "I'll be waiting." Leah's heart raced as she glanced at the old photograph one last time. The figure was still in the window, watching her, waiting for her to return. Whatever it wasn't finished with her yet. The rain tapped steadily against the windows as Emily unpacked the last of her boxes. She had just moved into the old Victorian house that had been in her family for generations. It was a grand, beautiful home with intricate woodwork, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the faint light of the stormy afternoon. But there was one room in the house that always made her uneasy, the parlor. It wasn't the room itself that bothered her, but the portrait that hung above the fireplace. The painting was of a young girl, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her dark hair pulled back in soft waves. The girl's eyes were piercing, almost lifelike, and no matter where you stood in the room, they seemed to follow you. As a child, Emily had always hated the portrait. Her grandmother had told her it was of a distant relative, long since passed, but there was something about the painting that felt wrong. Now, standing in the parlor again after so many years, the same unease washed over her. The girl's eyes seemed even more intense, as if they were watching her closely. Emily shook her head, trying to brush off the feeling. It was just a painting, nothing more. But as she moved around the room, Unpacking books and setting up furniture, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Later that evening, as the rain continued to fall and the house grew darker, Emily found herself sitting in the parlor, a cup of tea in her hands. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. The portrait loomed above her, the girl's eyes glinting in the firelight. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, expecting a message from a friend checking in, but her stomach tightened when she saw the text. "She's watching you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the portrait, the girl's face seeming more menacing now. She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She doesn't like when you ignore her." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her eyes flicked back to the portrait, and for a brief moment she thought she saw the girl's expression change. The soft, lifeless smile had shifted, becoming something darker. She stood up from the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved closer to the portrait, her breath shallow. The girl's eyes were still locked on hers, but now they seemed almost angry. Emily backed away, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It was just a painting, nothing more. But her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands, she checked the message. "Don't turn your back on her." Emily's pulse quickened. She glanced around the room, her hands shaking. The shadows seemed to stretch farther now, the fire casting strange shapes on the walls. Her mind screamed at her to leave the room, to get out of the house, but her legs felt frozen in place. Slowly, she turned back to the painting, her heart pounding in her ears. The girl's eyes were no longer just watching her, they were glaring. The once soft features of the portrait had become twisted, angry. Emily's breath hitched as she stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Her phone buzzed again. She's not happy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. Emily backed away from the painting, her hands trembling as the shadows in the room grew darker. She needed to get out. Whatever was happening wasn't normal. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the fire, casting an eerie glow over the portrait. Emily's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. A soft creak echoed through the room. Emily froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly, her flashlight illuminating the corners of the room. There was no one there, just the soft crackling of the fire and the rain tapping against the windows. But when she turned back to the portrait, the girl was gone. Emily's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her phone falling to the floor with a clatter. The frame of the painting was still there, but the girl, she wasn't. The canvas was blank, just an empty expanse of darkness. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. "She's behind you." Emily's scream echoed through the house as she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The parlor was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. She grabbed her phone and bolted for the front door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. As she reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, she glanced back toward the parlor. The portrait was back in place, the girl staring out from the canvas once again. But her expression was different now, calm, almost content. Emily's phone buzzed one last time. "She won't let you leave." If this story made you think twice about old portraits, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if a painting seemed to watch your every move? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle this chilling encounter. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, be sure to subscribe for more eerie tales. You never know what might be watching. Max had always been curious about the locked basement door. Ever since moving into the old house a few months ago, He had explored every nook and cranny except for the basement. The previous owner had been clear, don't go down there. The door stays locked. Max had shrugged it off, assuming it was a warning to keep out of an unstable part of the house. But as the days passed, that door gnawed at his curiosity. One rainy night, Max finally decided to investigate. It felt like the kind of story you'd read in one of those good horror novels, the type where the main character ignores all the warnings and pays the price. He grabbed his keys, a flashlight, and made his way to the basement. The door was old, its wood cracked and warped from years of neglect. The key slid into the lock with a heavy click, and the door creaked open, revealing a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. Max hesitated, gripping the flashlight tightly. The air that wafted up from the basement was cold, musty, and heavy with a strange dampness. He flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick dust hanging in the air. Slowly, he made his way down the stairs. The walls were made of stone, and the deeper he went, the colder it became. It felt like stepping into one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the basement always hides something terrible. At the bottom of the stairs, Max found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The floor was dirt, uneven and cold under his feet. There were a few old tools scattered around, but the room was mostly empty except for one thing. A door. It was smaller than the first, wooden and bolted shut with heavy iron latches. Max's heart raced as he approached it, his flashlight flickering slightly. The door looked ancient, older than anything else in the house, and it was clear no one had touched it in years. He knelt down, examining the latch. It was rusty, but with some effort, he was able to pry it open. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend, but what he saw made his stomach drop. "Don't open it." The message was from an unknown number. Max stared at the screen, his hands shaking. How could someone know what he was doing? He glanced around the dark basement, half expecting to see someone watching him. But the room was empty. He quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Turn back." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the small door, now unlatched, its wood creaking slightly in the silence of the basement. Everything in him screamed to leave it alone, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He placed his hand on the door and slowly pulled it open. The stench hit him first foul, like rotting wood and damp earth. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the small space beyond the door. There was a faint sound, like whispering, coming from deep inside. Max stepped into the room, his breath fogging in front of him. The temperature had dropped even further, and the whispering grew louder. It was almost like the walls themselves were alive, murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Max spun around, his heart racing. He rushed to the door, trying to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a faint sound, it was a chorus of voices, angry and demanding. His phone buzzed again. "You shouldn't have opened it." Max's hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, typing back what's happening. The reply came immediately. "They're coming." The whispering intensified, filling the room like a storm. Max's flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic beams of light across the small space. He backed away from the door, his mind racing, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. And then he saw them. Figures, faint and shadowy, began to form in the corners of the room. Their outlines were barely visible, but their eyes cold, hollow eyes glowed in the darkness. Max's pulse quickened as he stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering out completely, plunging him into darkness. The whispering was all around him now, close, suffocating. He could feel their presence, closing in on him, their cold breath on his neck. His phone buzzed again. It's too late. Max's heart pounded as he backed against the wall, his hands trembling as he tried to turn the flashlight back on. But the room was too dark, and the whispering was too loud. The figures were closer now, their eyes fixed on him. He could feel the cold closing in, wrapping around him like a vice. The air was thick with dread, and Max knew deep down that whatever he had unleashed, it wasn't going to let him leave. His phone buzzed one last time. Welcome to the dark. Max's scream echoed through the basement as the shadows closed in, and then silence. Sophie had always been fascinated by antiques. She loved the history and mystery they carried, as if each item had a story to tell. One afternoon, while wandering through a small, dusty antique shop on the outskirts of town, Sophie spotted something that immediately caught her eye: a porcelain doll, sitting on a high shelf, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its face was cracked in several places, giving it a slightly eerie appearance. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's interest and approached her with a smile. That doll has been here for a long time. Some say it's cursed. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Cursed? The shopkeeper nodded. Strange things have happened to those who've owned it. But it's just an old story, something to scare the curious away. Sophie chuckled, intrigued. She had always loved good horror novels and scary stories to tell at sleepovers when she was younger. The idea of a haunted doll only added to its appeal. Without much thought, she bought it, ignoring the shopkeeper's warnings. After all, how scary could an old doll really be? That night, Sophie placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, its eyes facing the bed. She admired the craftsmanship of the doll's delicate features, despite its worn appearance. She felt a strange connection to it, like it had been waiting for her to find it. As she got into bed, she noticed that the doll's gaze seemed to follow her around the room, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim glow of her bedside lamp. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook off the feeling. It was just her imagination, fueled by the shopkeeper's ghost stories. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the doll was watching her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but instead she saw a message from an unknown number. Do you like your new doll? Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. Who could have known she had just bought the doll? She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She's watching you." A chill ran down her spine as she glanced over at the doll. Its glass eyes gleamed in the darkness, staring straight at her. Sophie felt a wave of unease wash over her. She grabbed the doll, quickly placing it in the closet, out of sight. But even with the door closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching her. Her phone buzzed again. You can't hide her. Sophie's hands shook as she typed back, "Who are you? Stop messing with me." There was a long pause before the reply came. She doesn't like to be ignored. Sophie's heart raced. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she approached the closet. She hesitated before opening the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she swung it open, the doll was sitting there, its eyes fixed on her. Her phone buzzed again. Let her out. Sophie stumbled back, her mind racing. How was this happening? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where an innocent object turns into something far more sinister. She grabbed the doll, her hands shaking, and hurried to the living room, placing it on the couch. She needed to get rid of it. The shopkeeper's warning suddenly didn't seem so silly. As she stood there, trying to calm her nerves, her phone buzzed once more. She's angry. Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the doll. It wasn't sitting on the couch anymore. It had fallen or been moved onto the floor. Its face turned toward her, its cracked smile looking more menacing now. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the shopkeeper and demand an explanation. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. She wants to play. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, her hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. The doll seemed to radiate a dark energy, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim light. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The temperature dropped even further, and Sophie's breath fogged in front of her. She could feel the presence of something not of this world. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. Let's play. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, she saw the doll, standing upright now, its cracked face staring directly at her, its smile wider, twisted. Her breath hitched as she backed away, her mind screaming for her to leave the house. But before she could move, the doll took a step forward. Sophie's scream echoed through the darkened room, but no one was there to hear it. If this story made you rethink buying old dolls, don't forget to hit like. Have you ever owned something that gave you the creeps? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you would do in Sophie's situation. And if you love scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. You never know what might be waiting in the shadows. Sophie had always been fascinated by antiques. She loved the history and mystery they carried, as if each item had a story to tell. One afternoon, while wandering through a small, dusty antique shop on the outskirts of town, Sophie spotted something that immediately caught her eye: a porcelain doll, sitting on a high shelf, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its face was cracked in several places, giving it a slightly eerie appearance. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's interest and approached her with a smile. That doll has been here for a long time. Some say it's cursed. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Cursed. The shopkeeper nodded. Strange things have happened to those who've owned it, but it's just an old story, something to scare the curious away. Sophie chuckled, intrigued. She had always loved good horror novels and scary stories to tell at sleepovers when she was younger. The idea of a haunted doll only added to its appeal. Without much thought, she bought it, ignoring the shopkeeper's warnings. After all, how scary could an old doll really be? That night, Sophie placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, its eyes facing the bed. She admired the craftsmanship of the doll's delicate features, despite its worn appearance. She felt a strange connection to it, like it had been waiting for her to find it. As she got into bed, she noticed that the doll's gaze seemed to follow her around the room, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim glow of her bedside lamp. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook off the feeling. It was just her imagination, fueled by the shopkeeper's ghost stories. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the doll was watching her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but instead, she saw a message from an unknown number. Do you like your new doll? Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. Who could have known she had just bought the doll? She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She's watching you." The chill ran down her spine as she glanced over at the doll. Its glass eyes gleamed in the darkness, staring straight at her. Sophie felt a wave of unease wash over her. She grabbed the doll, quickly placing it in the closet, out of sight. But even with the door closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching her. Her phone buzzed again. You can't hide her. Sophie's hands shook as she typed back, "Who are you? Stop messing with me." There was a long pause before the reply came. She doesn't like to be ignored. Sophie's heart raced. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she approached the closet. She hesitated before opening the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she swung it open, the doll was sitting there, its eyes fixed on her. Her phone buzzed again. Let her out. Sophie stumbled back, her mind racing. How was this happening? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where an innocent object turns into something far more sinister. She grabbed the doll, her hands shaking, and hurried to the living room, placing it on the couch. She needed to get rid of it. The shopkeeper's warning suddenly didn't seem so silly. As she stood there, trying to calm her nerves, her phone buzzed once more. She's angry. Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the doll. It wasn't sitting on the couch anymore. It had fallen or been moved onto the floor, its face turned toward her, its cracked smile looking more menacing now. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the shopkeeper and demand an explanation. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. She wants to play. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, her hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. The doll seemed to radiate a dark energy, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim light. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The temperature dropped even further, and Sophie's breath fogged in front of her. She could feel the presence of something not of this world. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. Let's play. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, she saw the doll, standing upright now, its cracked face staring directly at her, its smile wider, twisted. Her breath hitched as she backed away, her mind screaming for her to leave the house. But before she could move, the doll took a step forward. Sophie's scream echoed through the darkened room, but no one was there to hear it. If this story made you rethink buying old dolls, don't forget to hit like. Have you ever owned something that gave you the creeps? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you would do in Sophie's situation. And if you love scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more spine tingling.